He had been the favorite son. This is the foundational fact about him, the one that has to be established at the beginning because everything else in his life makes sense only against it. The mother had loved him in a way she had not loved her older son. The father, by every available account from those who knew the family, had recognized in him qualities that the older brother lacked. The household around him, in the years of his early childhood, had organized itself around the small fact of his presence in the way households organize themselves around babies who have arrived to settled mothers in stable circumstances. He had been wanted. He had been celebrated. The British nation, in February 1960, had set off 41 gun salutes for his birth. He had also, from those earliest years, absorbed the lesson that everyone around him bowed. The household staff bowed. The visitors bowed. The cousins, when they came on the small family visits that royal childhoods produce, bowed. The boy who would grow into the man this documentary is about did not learn at any point in his early years that his social position required adjustment to other people's. Other people adjusted to him. The world reorganized itself around his presence. The reorganization was the foundational condition of his life, and it would remain the foundational condition for the next 65 years. He grew up. He went to school. He served in the Falklands and produced in 1982 the brief period of authentic public credit that the rest of his life would attempt to extract permanent identity from. He married. He divorced. He became the United Kingdom's special representative for international trade and investment, and, across the decade he held that position, asked for gifts at meetings with foreign heads of state and accepted them when they were offered. He befriended, sometime in the late 1990s, a wealthy American financier named Jeffrey Epstein. The friendship continued, with documented intensity, even after Epstein was convicted in 2008 of soliciting prostitution from a minor. The friendship continued past Epstein's death in 2019. The friendship has, in some way that the historical record will eventually make clearer, continued to define Andrew's public position in the years since. In 2014, a young woman named Virginia Roberts Giuffre alleged that Epstein had trafficked her to Andrew when she was 17 years old. Andrew denied the allegations. Across the next 8 years he denied them in various forms, including in a televised BBC interview in November 2019 that has been widely identified as one of the most catastrophic self-inflicted public relations disasters in modern royal history. He settled her civil lawsuit in February 2022 for a sum that has been reported, though never officially confirmed, as approximately £12 million. The settlement included no admission of liability. It also included a statement in which Andrew acknowledged that Giuffre had been an established victim of abuse and regrets his association with Epstein. Virginia Giuffre took her own life on the 24th of April, 2025. She was 41 years old. She had spent the last decade of her life pursuing, with extraordinary courage, the public accountability that the network of men who had abused her had spent 20 years attempting to prevent. Her posthumous memoir, Nobody's Girl, was published on the 21st of October 2025, 6 months after her death. 6 days later, on the 30th of October 2025, King Charles III stripped his younger brother of his prince title and evicted him from his royal residence. The action was the first of its kind taken against a British prince in over 100 years. It was taken because the institution had at last concluded that protecting Andrew was no longer institutionally sustainable. The pressure from the public, from the press, from the political establishment of the country had become greater than the pressure to maintain the protection. The protection had ended. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, no longer a prince, no longer His Royal Highness, no longer permitted to occupy the royal lodge that had been his home for over 20 years, would move to a property at Sandringham, funded privately by his brother. This is where the story ends. The story this documentary is about is the long arc that produced the ending. 65 years of accumulated entitlement, 40 years of documented bullying of staff, 2 decades of friendship with a convicted sex offender, the civil settlement, the interview, the titles, and the eviction, and the woman who had spent her last decade pursuing the truth and who would not in the end live to see the full institutional consequence of her pursuit. Before diving deeper on that, consider subscribing our channel and push the bell icon so you get all the updates about our channel. This documentary is about the women around him, the wife who absorbed the early years of his marital pattern and was by 1992 photographed having her toes sucked by her financial advisor in the south of France. The two daughters who emerged somehow from the household conditions of the marriage as functional adults. The staff who absorbed his bullying across decades and who have, since the publication of Andrew Loney's 2025 biography entitled, finally begun to produce the documentary record that the institution had spent 40 years preventing. The trafficking victims of the Epstein network whose names the public will in many cases never know. And Virginia Giuffre, who paid the price more visibly than any of the others and who did not live to see the day the price was finally partially acknowledged. These are the women. This is what they paid. The man at the center of all of it had been from his earliest years entitled, and the entitlement applied across 65 years to the people who came within range of his life, had cost them in the precise ways that this documentary will examine. He was born on the 19th of February 1960 at Buckingham Palace. The birth was the first of a reigning British monarch's children in over 100 years. Queen Victoria's youngest, Princess Beatrice, had been born in 1857, and no British monarch since Victoria had produced children while actually on the throne. The Queen was 33. She had been on the throne for 8 years. Her older two children, Charles then 11 and Anne then 9, had both been born before her accession in February 1952, in the period when she was still Princess Elizabeth and her own father George VI had still been alive. The pregnancy was, by every available account, a deliberately welcomed one. The Queen had wanted another child. The first two children had been raised in their early years in conditions that her accession had then disrupted. She had become queen when Charles was 3 and Anne was 18 months. The early childhoods of both older children had been substantially absorbed by the institutional demands of the new reign. The Queen had wanted, somewhere in her own internal calculation, the chance to have a child whose early childhood she could be more present for. Andrew was that child. The Queen, by various accounts of the family during this period, was visibly more relaxed with him than she had been with Charles. She had time. The reign had settled into its working rhythm. The institutional pressures that had defined the early 1950s had given way to the more manageable pressures of an established monarch. She could, with this third child, do some of the maternal work that the older two had not received from her in equivalent measure. The household around the young prince responded accordingly. He was the favorite. This was not a secret. The other children in the family, Charles and Anne, observed it from the beginning. Charles, in particular, registered the differential treatment with the kind of accuracy that his temperament had been giving him about every other dimension of family life. He had been the older brother who had absorbed the institutional pressures of his position from infancy. Andrew was the younger brother who, by every visible indication, had been positioned to absorb less of those pressures and more of the maternal warmth that Charles had not, in his own early years, been positioned to receive. The differential continued. Anne, born in 1950 to similar conditions, did not protest the new family arithmetic. Anne, by the temperament she would develop into, did not protest most family arithmetic, and she had her own particular relationship with their father that compensated for whatever maternal warmth Andrew was monopolizing. But Charles felt it. The feeling would, across his subsequent decades, build into the kind of complicated sibling relationship that had, by the 1990s, settled into a working coolness between the two brothers that family insiders had come to recognize as one of the durable features of the senior royal generation. A second younger brother, Edward, was born in 1964. By that point, the family pattern was set. Andrew was the mother's favorite. Edward was the youngest, occupying his own position in the family arithmetic without disrupting Andrew's place at the center of the maternal warmth. The four children across their childhoods would calibrate themselves to the differential. Andrew would get more of the mother's available attention than the other three. The other three would absorb the implications. What this produced in Andrew, across the years of his early childhood, is the foundational psychological fact that this documentary is built around. He absorbed, from the family's structure, the conviction that he was the central figure of the world he was operating in. The conviction was not entirely unjustified. The mother's preference was real. The household's accommodation of him was real. The visiting cousins and family friends, who had absorbed the family's preferences, treated him with the warmth that the preferences communicated. He was, in his own early experience, the genuinely most loved child of the most powerful family in the country. The experience formed his expectations. The expectations would, across his next 60 years, continue to operate. The early education was conducted, in the conventional way, at Buckingham Palace by a governess. The governess in his case was named Catherine Peebles, called Miss B by the children. She had also taught Charles. The contrast in her relationships with the two boys was visible. Charles, as we have documented in another examination of his life, had been a sensitive and difficult student whose temperament had not matched his governess's expectations. Andrew was, by every account, the easier child. He did the work. He produced the kind of cheerful, confident engagement with the lessons that pleased Miss B in the ways Charles never quite managed. The differential was real, and Miss B responded to it. Andrew was her favorite among the children she taught. Charles, again, registered this. At the age of 8, in 1968, Andrew was sent to a preparatory school called Heatherdown in Berkshire. Charles had attended Cheam, a different preparatory school in Berkshire, for the same age range. The two boys were not sent to the same school. The institutional logic of this was clear enough. The second-born son did not need to follow the heir's specific educational path, and the family had determined that Heatherdown was a more appropriate fit for Andrew's particular temperament. He thrived there. The school produced, across his 3 years of attendance, the kind of confident, competent boy that the family had been hoping it would produce. In 1973, at the age of 13, he followed his father and his older brother to Gordonstown in Scotland. The school had become, by that point, the family's standard secondary educational institution. Philip had attended it, Charles had attended it, Anne had attended Benenden, a girls' school, but the boys had all gone to Gordonstown in succession. Edward would follow in 1977. Charles's experience at Gordonstown, as we have documented, had been one of the formative miseries of his life. He had hated the school. The school had not, in its institutional culture, accommodated his particular temperament. The bullying he had absorbed there had become one of the defining features of his subsequent psychological architecture. Andrew's experience at Gordonstown was different. He did not, by every account from those who attended the school with him, hate it. He fit into the institutional culture in a way Charles had not. He was more physically robust. He was more temperamentally suited to the rough boarding school environment that Gordonstown produced. He was, in the institutional metrics that the school applied, a successful student. He was also, by the recollections of those who attended the school with him, the kind of student his classmates noticed in particular ways. In Andrew Loney's biography of the ex-Duke of York, entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, the author spoke to a number of Andrew's former classmates at Gordonstown. One woman recalls Andrew as a very slimy so-and-so, arrogant, pleased with himself, a bully. He thinks he's funny, handsome and clever, and he isn't, she added. Another former student claimed that Andrew was so full of himself and would literally often say, "You do know who I am." The Gordonstown alumni added, people were wary of him. The phrase that recurs in these accounts is the one Andrew, by the recollections of his classmates, used most consistently to assert his social position. "You do know who I am?" He was 13, 14, 15 years old. He was at boarding school, in the same dormitories and the same dining halls and the same playing fields as his classmates. The democratic fiction that boarding schools of his generation maintained, the fiction that all the boys, regardless of their backgrounds, were equal members of the same institution, was the fiction that other boys of similar privilege had absorbed and operated under. Andrew had not absorbed it. He had carried into Gordonstown the conviction that he was different from the other boys, that the difference was real, and that any social interaction in which the difference had been forgotten could be corrected by the question that asserted it. The question was the foundation of his later pattern. "You do know who I am?" The question expected the answer the asker had always received. The asker was the Queen's son. The asker was the favorite child. The asker was, by the logic that had been operating around him since infancy, the central figure of any room he was in. The classmates who failed to acknowledge the centrality were not, in Andrew's framework, behaving democratically. They were behaving incorrectly. The question was the correction. The classmates remembered the corrections. They remembered, by the accounts assembled in Loney's book and elsewhere, the way Andrew had used his position to extract small acknowledgments of his status from his peers. They had not, on the whole, enjoyed the experience. even if he didn't quite get along with a lot of the guys who, as one alumni noted, thought he was a wally and tosser. The former Duke of York had an ever-changing circle of female conquests per Loney, nicknamed Randy Andy. Andrew dated a number of girls. The nickname Randy Andy, earned at school, before he had begun his naval career, before he had become a public adult figure, would follow him for the rest of his life. It was applied to him by classmates and by the press in the way nicknames are applied to public figures whose conduct has produced them. The conduct that produced this nickname was the conduct of a teenage boy who had absorbed from his early experience the conviction that women were available to him and would, in their natural responses, accommodate his interest. The conviction would, across his subsequent decades, find expression in the various sexual relationships that defined his public image through the late 1970s and the 1980s. The pattern was set at school. The pattern would not, across the rest of his life, fundamentally modify. A specific relationship from the Gordonstown period, recalled in Lani's book by the woman who had been involved in it, captured a different dimension of Andrew that the more critical accounts have tended to overlook. A student who shared a relationship with Andrew in his final year at Gordonstown shared a much different opinion than the others. He was kind, generous, and trusting of me, and it was a great responsibility to be discreet, she said, describing him as a young man who was naive and mistrusted people in case they took advantage of him. The recollection is preserved in the historical record. It is not the only recollection. It is one perspective from one woman who, by her own statement, had a positive relationship with Andrew during his final year of school. The recollection complicates in the way that honest documentary work has to permit complications, the simpler account of him as straightforwardly arrogant and unkind. He had, to some women in some periods of his life, presented as the kind of young man whose personal warmth was real and whose generosity was real. The presentations were probably both real and not. He was capable of producing the warmth. He was also capable of producing the entitlement. The two coexisted across his life. The challenge for honest documentary is to preserve both. What this documentary will be doing, across the parts that follow, is preserving both while attending most carefully to what the entitlement produced for the people who could not access the warmth. The classmates who heard you do know who I am. The staff who absorbed his bullying, the trafficking victims of the Epstein network who, by the time they encountered Andrew, were not in any position to receive the warmth he was capable of producing for women he had selected to receive it. These were the people who paid the cost of his entitlement. The girlfriend in his final year of school had received the warmth. The other categories of women who came within range of his life across his subsequent 6 decades had received, in different forms and to different degrees, the cost. Gordonstown ended in 1979. He had received his secondary education. He was 19 years old. The next phase of his life, the Royal Navy and the Falklands, would produce the brief period of authentic public achievement that the rest of his life would orient itself around. The achievement was real. It had not yet happened at the time of his school's conclusion in 1979, but it was waiting in 1982, 3 years ahead, and the public version of him that the country would produce in response to it was the version that has shaped his official biography ever since. Before the Falklands, however, there was the year between school and the Navy, and there was the early naval training, and there was the small accumulation of details about the kind of young man he was becoming. The class privileges he had carried into school were carried out of school as well. The conviction of centrality remained. The expectation that women were available to him remained. The willingness to assert his social position when it had been insufficiently acknowledged remained. He was, in all the ways that mattered for the next 60 years of his public life, already the figure he would continue to be. He had been the favorite son. He continued to be the favorite son. The Queen's preference for him persisted across his adolescence and into his adulthood with the kind of consistency that her own emotional discipline had imposed on her relationships with all 4 of her children. She did not waver in her affections. The affection she had directed at him in his infancy continued to be directed at him in his late teens. The household that had organized itself around him continued, in the small ways royal households organize themselves, to provide the institutional acknowledgement that the affection produced. He took it for granted. The taking for granted was the foundation on which the rest of his life would be built. He had absorbed, across his early years, the conviction that the world was arranged around him. He had not absorbed the contrary lesson, the lesson most adolescents eventually absorb, that the world is in fact arranged for the convenience of many other people, and that a person's place in it is something that has to be negotiated rather than assumed. He had not negotiated, he had assumed. The assumption had served him so far. The Falklands, when it came in 1982, would produce for the first and last time in his public life the kind of authentic public achievement that justified the assumption on its own terms. The justification would not last, the assumption would. And the gap between the lasting assumption and the temporary justification would, across the decades that followed, produce most of the difficulties that this documentary is built around. In the part that follows, we move to the Falklands, the HMS Invincible, the Sea King helicopter, the genuine courage that Andrew did demonstrate during a real war that produced real casualties on both sides, the brief period of his public life when he was, by the metrics that public valor is measured by, a figure who had earned the country's respect. The period would last, in active operational form, for approximately 3 months. The figure he had been before the war and the figure he would become after it would be in essential ways continuous with each other. The war had not transformed him. The war had given him briefly the public credit that he had not previously earned, and that he would, across the next 4 decades, attempt to extend into a permanent identity that the actual record of his subsequent conduct would not in any meaningful sense support. The war began on the 2nd of April 1982. Argentine forces, acting on orders from the military junta that had been governing the country since 1976, invaded the Falkland Islands, a small group of British-administered territories in the South Atlantic that Argentina had claimed sovereignty over for more than a century. The invasion took the British government, led by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, by surprise. The Falklands had not been a major focus of British strategic attention. The garrison defending them had been small. The Argentine invading force overwhelmed it within hours. The British response was, by the standards of late 20th century European foreign policy, extraordinary. Thatcher decided, within days of the invasion, that Britain would mount a military operation to retake the islands. The operation would require sending a task force of Royal Navy ships 8,000 miles to the South Atlantic. It would require fighting a war against a Latin American military government that nobody had been expecting to fight. It would require, in the practical reality of the operation, the deployment of forces that included some of the most capable units of the British Armed Services, and that would, when assembled, constitute the largest British military operation since the Suez Crisis of 1956. Among the forces being assembled was the aircraft carrier HMS Invincible. The Invincible was one of only 2 operational aircraft carriers in the Royal Navy in 1982. Its presence in the task force was strategically essential. Without it, the British forces would have been unable to provide the air cover that the operation required. The ship had been commissioned in 1980. It was relatively new. Its deployment to the South Atlantic was its first major operational service. Aboard the Invincible was Andrew. He was 22 years old. He had been in the Royal Navy since 1979 after completing his Gordonstown education. He had trained as a helicopter pilot. He had been awarded his wings. He had completed his operational training and joined 820 Naval Air Squadron, the Sea King helicopter squadron based on the Invincible. By the time the war began, he was a sub-lieutenant. He was, by every available account, a competent young naval officer. He was also structurally the second in line to the British throne. His older brother Charles was the heir. Andrew was second. The mother, whose preference for him had defined his childhood, was now the head of state of the country whose forces were about to engage in a real war. The British government's first instinct when the war began and the Invincible was identified for the task force was to remove Andrew from operational service. The cabinet, by various subsequent accounts, sought to move him to a desk role for the duration of the war. The reasoning was practical. The risk of a member of the royal family being killed in combat was a risk the government did not want to bear. The propaganda implications of a royal death, for both sides of the conflict, were significant enough to justify, in the government's calculation, the institutional inconvenience of removing Andrew from his squadron. The Queen refused. This is the important detail that has been preserved in the historical record. She did not want her son removed from operational service. She had spent her life by that point absorbing the institutional logic of the British monarchy, the logic that held that royal duties were duties, that royal sons should serve when called to serve, and that removing Andrew from his squadron because of his royal status would have been a violation of the principles that the institution depended on. She decided that he would go with his ship. The government accepted her decision. Andrew sailed with the Invincible. What followed across the next 3 months was the period of his life that would define his subsequent public reputation. He flew operational missions. The missions were real. The risks were real. The Argentine forces possessed the French-designed Exocet anti-ship missile, a sophisticated weapon that flew at very low altitudes over the waves and that had during the early phases of the war demonstrated its capacity to sink British ships. The Argentine forces had used exocets to sink the destroyer HMS Sheffield on the 4th of May 1982, with the loss of 20 crew members. They had used them to sink the container ship Atlantic Conveyor on the 25th of May 1982. They were the principal threat to the British task force. Defending against them was one of the most dangerous tasks the British forces had to perform. The defense involved, among other tactics, the use of helicopters as decoys. The helicopters would hover near the British ships, mimicking the radar signature of the ships themselves, drawing the Exocet missiles toward the helicopters and away from the actual ships. The tactic required the helicopter pilots to operate in conditions of genuine danger, flying at low altitudes, near the surface of the water, with the knowledge that incoming Exocets might lock onto them rather than the ships they were protecting. The pilots who performed this duty were performing one of the most psychologically demanding tasks the war produced. Andrew was one of the pilots performing it. By his own subsequent account, in the interview he gave to United Press International in June 1982, "I flew 3 to 4 hours a day piloting his Royal Navy Sea King helicopter behind the HMS Invincible to serve as a decoy to Exocet missiles." He recalled being on decoy duty when the Sheffield was hit. "For the first 10 minutes after the Sheffield, I think when one really didn't know which way to turn or what to do, I know where I was, and I was very frightened then. The fear was real, the conditions were real." The Atlantic Conveyor sinking when it came on the 25th of May was witnessed by Andrew from his helicopter. He participated in the rescue operation that recovered the survivors. The moment, by his own subsequent recollection, was something I shall never ever forget. It was quite horrific. At the same time, I saw a 4.5 shell come quite close to us. I saw my ship Invincible firing her missiles. This is the part of his life that needs to be preserved with full honesty in any honest documentary about him. He did the work. He did it under real fire. He was 22 years old, in a war that was killing British and Argentine sailors at a rate that was significant by the standards of post-1945 European combat, and he was performing one of the most dangerous tasks the war required. He did not avoid the duty. He did not, by any account that has been preserved, attempt to extract himself from the conditions that other young naval officers were operating in. He was, for those 3 months, a competent and courageous member of his squadron. The professional assessments from those who served with him support this. Commander Nigel Ward's memoir, Sea Harrier over the Falklands, described Andrew as an excellent pilot and a very promising officer. A British Ministry of Defence spokesperson, in interviews after the war, described him as being one hell of a helicopter pilot. The phrases were not produced by political pressure. They were produced by professional military officers whose own reputations would have been damaged if the assessments had been later contradicted by subordinates who had served with Andrew during the war. The assessments held. They were accurate. The war ended on the 14th of June 1982 with the Argentine surrender at Stanley. The British task force had retaken the islands. The cost had been substantial: 255 British military personnel killed, 649 Argentine military personnel killed, 3 Falkland Islanders killed, several British and Argentine ships sunk. By the standards of post-1945 wars between developed nations, it had been a real war that had produced real casualties. Andrew had served in it. He had done his job. He had emerged from it with the kind of military reputation that the British public, in its traditional regard for military service, valued substantially. The Invincible returned to Portsmouth on the 17th of September 1982. The mother and the father were waiting on the dock to welcome the ship home. The photograph of the Queen and Prince Philip greeting their son on his return from the war became one of the iconic images of the conflict. The young prince in his naval uniform walking down the gangplank to be embraced by his mother. The country watching the broadcast absorbed the image as one of the defining moments of the war's conclusion. The war had been won. The royal family had served alongside the rest of the country. The young prince had been one of the heroes. The image confirmed everything the country wanted to believe about the institution that had sent him to fight. What followed, in the months and years after the war, was the construction of the Andrew that the country would carry in its public memory for the next 40 years. This is the part of the story that has to be examined carefully, because the construction was real and the foundation it was constructed on was also real. The Falklands service had been authentic. The danger had been authentic. The professional performance had been authentic. The Andrew who returned from the war in September 1982 was, in the precise sense that public hero status is earned, a young man who had earned a portion of public regard, but the construction extended past what the foundation could support. Across the months and years after the war, Andrew himself, and the palace press operation that supported him, and the British media that had a commercial interest in royal hero narratives, began to extend the public version of his Falklands service into something larger than the actual record could justify. He began to give the impression in interviews and public appearances that the war had been the central defining experience of his identity. He spoke of it frequently. He referred to it in social settings, often in ways that those who knew him at close range began to find uncomfortable. The 3 months of operational service was being asked to do work that 3 months of service could not by itself accomplish. The work it was being asked to do was the work of producing a permanent identity. Andrew, in the years after the war, did not have a clear next phase of his life. The Falklands had been the high point of his naval career. He continued in the Royal Navy until 2001, but the subsequent decades of service were not, by the standards of operational naval careers, particularly distinguished. He commanded a minesweeper. He served as a helicopter instructor. He worked at the Ministry of Defense. He performed the duties of a senior naval officer of his generation in the kind of operational quiet that characterized British military service for most of the 1980s and 1990s. The Falklands had been the war. There was not in any sustained way going to be another one for him to participate in. This created a structural problem that Andrew in the rest of his life never fully solved. He had been a hero at 22. He was 30 at the end of the 1980s. He was 40 in 2000. He was 60 in 2020. The hero status he had earned in the spring of 1982 was, by the time he was a middle-aged man, increasingly distant. The public, which has a finite memory for military valor that is not periodically refreshed by new achievements, was beginning to forget. The Falklands had been a war. It had also been one war, ending in a particular set of weeks in 1982, and the public significance of having served in it was always going to diminish across the decades that followed. Andrew did not accept this diminishment. He continued to refer to the war. He continued, by various accounts of those who served with him in his later naval career and observed him in his subsequent civilian roles, to position himself as a Falklands veteran in social settings where the position was no longer particularly relevant. The pattern became, across the 1990s and 2000s, one of the small features of his public personality that those who watched him noticed. What the pattern revealed, about him and about the structure of his life, was the absence of the post-war achievements that would have, in different lives, supplemented and eventually replaced the Falklands at the center of his public identity. He had no other achievements of comparable significance. He had been a young naval officer who had served well in a real war, and then he had been a senior royal who for the next 40 years had not produced anything that approached the public significance of those 3 months in 1982. The disproportion between the achievement and the time he was attempting to make it sustain produced, predictably, the kind of public posture that those who observed it found increasingly hollow. The honest accounting then has to hold both elements together. The Falklands service was real. The man who served in it was, for those months, performing at the level of authentic public valor. The construction that was built on top of the service was in significant measure larger than the service could justify. The construction had to be, because the rest of his life did not provide additional foundations to extend it on. Andrew's public identity across the decades that followed was disproportionately resting on 3 months in 1982. The disproportion would, in the end, be one of the features that contributed to his public collapse when the Epstein scandals began to dominate his public profile in the 2010s. The Falklands was no longer sufficient to compensate. The hero status had eroded too much. The new material was too much. The balance had shifted. There is a smaller feature of the post-Falklands period that this documentary needs to address before moving on, because it captures something specific about the way Andrew's privileged position would interact with the women who came within range of his life across the next 40 years. The feature concerns Giuffre Stark. Giuffre Stark was an American actress and photographer. She had been born in 1956. She had appeared in 1976 in a small role in a low-budget British erotic film called Emily, a film that by the standards of the period was the kind of mildly explicit picture that British actresses of her age occasionally appeared in early in their careers without the appearance being expected to define them. She had moved past the film. She had built a career that included other acting work and a developing career in photography. Andrew met her in February 1981. They began a relationship. By Tina Brown's later assessment, Stark was Andrew's only serious love interest of his early adult years. The relationship continued through his Falklands deployment and into the early autumn of 1982. In October 1982, after his return from the war, the couple holidayed together on the Caribbean island of Mustique. The holiday was photographed. The photographs appeared in the British press. The press, having identified Stark's earlier appearance in the Emily film, began to characterize her in the kind of language that British tabloids of the period reserved for women they had decided to make examples of. The palace and the British press, in coordinated pressure that the documentary record has preserved, made it clear to Andrew that the relationship could not continue. Stark was, in the institutional assessment of the people who managed Andrew's public life, the wrong kind of woman for him to be associated with. The earlier film appearance, which would in any reasonable assessment have been a footnote of her early career, was being used as the institutional justification for ending the relationship. Just a thing come into my mind. Tell us in the comments where you are from. Also, if you like this documentary, please consider subscribing. The relationship ended in 1983. Stark had given Andrew, by his own subsequent statements, the warmth of his most serious early relationship. The institutional pressure had decided that the warmth was not acceptable. Andrew had complied with the institutional decision. The complying tells you something about him that the next 40 years would continue to confirm. He had, when the institution required him to give up the woman his own affection had attached to, given her up. He had not fought the institutional pressure, he had accepted it. The acceptance was the framework he would operate within for the rest of his life, the framework that placed his own institutional position above the women who came within range of him. Stark, for her part, retained her dignity. She did not, in the years that followed the relationship's ending, sell her story to the British tabloids despite the financial offers that would have been available to her. She remained quiet. She became in 1997 the godmother of her own daughter Tatiana, and Andrew became Tatiana's godfather. The relationship between Andrew and Stark transitioned, across the years, into a friendship of the kind that former lovers sometimes maintain. When Andrew faced the Epstein accusations in 2015, Stark publicly defended him. The Stark case is preserved in this documentary because it tells you something about the framework Andrew operated within from his earliest adult years. The framework was institutional. The institution mattered more than the women he was involved with. When the institution decided a woman was not acceptable, the woman was set aside. Stark had been set aside in 1983 because the institution had decided her earlier film appearance disqualified her. The setting aside had been performed by Andrew with the cooperation that institutional discipline required. The pattern would, with grim consistency, continue across the next 4 decades. Andrew would form relationships. The relationships would, in various ways, encounter institutional or personal pressures. Andrew would, in most cases, prioritize the institution or his own convenience over the women involved. The women would, in different forms, pay the cost. Stark had paid one version of the cost. The wife he was about to marry, Sarah Ferguson, would pay another version. The trafficking victims of the Epstein network, in the decades that followed, would pay a much more serious version. The pattern was set in essential ways by the early adult Andrew, who had been formed by the family conditions and the Gordonstown lessons and the brief period of authentic Falklands service that we have now examined. In the part that follows, we move to the marriage. The 1986 wedding to Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, the two daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, the marriage that began in genuine affection and that by 1992 had produced one of the more famous British royal scandals of the late 20th century, the toe-sucking photographs, the financial advisor named John Bryan, the separation, the 1996 divorce, the unusual arrangement that followed, Andrew and Sarah continuing to live together at Royal Lodge for the next 30 years despite the formal end of their marriage, what the marriage had revealed about Andrew, what the unusual post-divorce arrangement revealed about both of them, and what the household at Royal Lodge had become by the time the institutional pressure in 2025 had finally required them both to leave it, after 20 years of cohabitation that the British royal family had been quietly absorbing across decades that had been, for the rest of the country, considerably more conventional. He met her in June 1985 at Royal Ascot. She was 25 years old. She had red hair, a strong personality, a willingness to laugh that the British aristocracy of her generation recognized as a particular kind of social asset. Her name was Sarah Ferguson. Her father, Major Ronald Ferguson, was Prince Charles's polo manager. Her mother had left the family when Sarah was a teenager, moving to Argentina with an Argentine polo player. The departure had produced in Sarah the kind of complicated relationship with the maternal that those who knew her at close range across her subsequent life would identify as one of the foundational features of her psychological architecture. Andrew and Sarah had in fact known each other for years before the Royal Ascot meeting in 1985. They had met as children. They had attended the same parties as adolescents. The British aristocratic world they had both grown up in was small enough that they had been since childhood peripheral figures in each other's lives without ever quite becoming central to each other. The Ascot meeting changed that. The Princess of Wales, Diana, who had married Charles in 1981 and had by that point become the most photographed woman in the world, had decided to play a role in introducing them. Diana had concluded, with the social intelligence that she brought to most of her institutional interactions, that Sarah was the kind of woman Andrew should be encouraged to consider. Sarah was confident. Sarah was unintimidated by the royal context. Sarah was, in Diana's assessment, the kind of woman who could absorb the institutional pressures of senior royal marriage without producing the difficulties that other women might produce. The encouragement worked. Andrew and Sarah began a relationship in the second half of 1985. The relationship developed quickly. By February 1986 they were engaged. The engagement was announced on the 19th of March 1986. The wedding took place on the 23rd of July 1986 at Westminster Abbey. The Queen created Andrew Duke of York on his wedding day. Sarah became in the same moment the Duchess of York. The wedding was watched by an estimated 500 million people around the world. The size of the audience was a function of the institutional moment. Diana had been the most photographed woman in the world for 5 years. The Charles-Diana wedding in 1981 had set the global template for late 20th century royal weddings. The Andrew-Sarah wedding was in the public's expectation the next instance of the genre. It would not, in retrospect, equal the Charles-Diana broadcast in cultural significance. Diana was an irreproducible figure, and Sarah was not in any sense an attempt to reproduce her, but the wedding was, by the metrics of late 20th century royal events, a substantial international occasion. The early years of the marriage produced the conventional outcomes. Princess Beatrice was born on the 8th of August 1988. Princess Eugenie was born on the 23rd of March 1990. The two daughters arrived in the household at Sunninghill Park, the country residence the Queen had given the couple as a wedding present. The household appeared, from the outside, to be operating along the conventional lines that senior royal marriages of the period typically operated along. Inside, the marriage was already showing signs of difficulty. Andrew was, by every account from those who knew the couple at close range, frequently absent. His naval career, which continued throughout the marriage, kept him at sea for extended periods. He was not in the practical reality of the daily life at Sunninghill, a present husband. Sarah, meanwhile, was attempting to construct her own public role. The Duchess of York, the slightly informal alternative to the Princess of Wales, the warmer-edged senior royal woman who could occupy the public space that Diana's particular position had created for figures like her. The construction was not, by every account, particularly successful. Sarah had genuine warmth and genuine intelligence. She did not have, in the institutional dimensions that royal public life required, the kind of disciplined external presentation that the role demanded. She made mistakes. The press began by the late 1980s to characterize her with the kind of mocking persistence that British tabloids reserved for figures they had decided to demolish. The mocking accelerated. By 1990, when Eugenie was born, Sarah was already the subject of the kind of negative coverage that no senior royal of the period had previously absorbed at her career stage. The press attacked her weight. The press attacked her clothing choices. The press attacked her social conduct, her family, her relationships with her father and her absent mother. The press, in the institutional logic that British tabloids of the period operated under, had decided that the Duchess of York was the senior royal woman they would extract the most commercial value from by destroying. The destruction was the daily background condition of her life across the early 1990s. Andrew, meanwhile, was at sea. The marriage was being absorbed by the press attacks while the husband was professionally absent. Sarah, by every account that has been preserved from the period, was struggling with the conditions in ways that her own particular psychological architecture made it difficult for her to articulate. She had married into the institution that had by 1990 become hostile to her, and she had married a man who was not in any practical sense available to support her through the hostility. The marriage began to come apart in early 1992. The separation was announced on the 19th of March of that year. The official statement was the conventional one. The couple had decided with mutual regret that they would no longer be living together as husband and wife. The conventional statement concealed, as such statements typically do, the more complicated reality that had produced the decision. The reality emerged 5 months later, in the British tabloid press, in the form that the marriage's ending would be remembered for. In August 1992, the Daily Mirror published photographs of Sarah on holiday at a villa in the south of France with a man named John Bryan. Bryan was an American financial advisor. He had been in the months leading up to the photographs Sarah's financial advisor, and by the visible evidence of the photographs, considerably more than that. The photographs showed Bryan kissing Sarah's feet. They showed him sucking her toes. They showed the kind of intimate physical contact between a married Duchess of York and a man who was not her husband that British tabloid journalism of 1992 was specifically designed to identify and publish. The photographs ran. The British press, across the subsequent weeks, ran them and the supporting story repeatedly. Sarah was at Balmoral with the rest of the royal family when the photographs first appeared. She was, by every subsequent account from those who were present at Balmoral that summer, completely humiliated. The Queen, by the conventional code of the senior royal generation, did not directly confront her about the photographs. The confrontation was not necessary. The institutional consequence was the consequence the system always applied. Sarah's place inside the family had been by the photographs made permanently provisional. She would never, in the sense that mattered for the rest of her life, fully recover the institutional standing she had occupied before the photographs ran. The divorce was finalized on the 30th of May 1996. The Queen, in the customary application of institutional language to the marriage's ending, allowed Sarah to retain the Duchess of York title but stripped her of the Her Royal Highness style. Sarah was, from 1996 forward, the Duchess of York rather than HRH, the Duchess of York. The distinction mattered to those who understood the institutional language. It marked her, in the family's continuing usage, as a former member rather than a current one. What was unusual about the dissolution of the marriage was not the divorce itself. Royal divorces by 1996 had become unfortunately common. Charles and Diana had separated in 1992 and would divorce in 1996. Princess Anne had divorced Mark Phillips in 1992. The unusual feature of the Andrew-Sarah dissolution was what came after the divorce. They continued to live together. This is the structural fact about their post-divorce arrangement that has, in retrospective examination, attracted the most attention. Andrew did not move out. Sarah did not move out. The two of them, despite the formal end of their marriage, continued to share a household, first at Sunninghill Park, then, after the 2007 sale of Sunninghill, at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. The arrangement persisted for nearly 30 years. It persisted until October 2025, when the institutional pressure that we will examine in later parts finally required both of them to leave Royal Lodge in the same eviction. The arrangement was unusual enough to be remarked on within the small world of British aristocratic observation. Divorced couples typically do not, in the conventional pattern, continue to share a household for 30 years after the divorce. The arrangement raised obvious questions about whether the divorce had, in any meaningful sense, ended the relationship between Andrew and Sarah. The questions were never definitively answered. Andrew and Sarah, by various accounts of those who knew them across the long period of cohabitation, occupied the household as old friends rather than as romantic partners. They had separate bedrooms, they had separate lives. They did, however, share the space, and the sharing of the space produced a continuity to their daily existence that the technical fact of the divorce did not interrupt. What this arrangement revealed about Andrew in retrospective examination has been the subject of various subsequent interpretations. The most generous interpretation is that the arrangement reflected the genuine residual affection that the marriage had produced between them. They had, by every account, been fond of each other. The marriage had failed in the particular ways marriages of their kind tended to fail in the late 20th century, but the underlying compatibility that had produced the marriage in the first place had not entirely disappeared. The cohabitation, by this interpretation, was the practical expression of the residual fondness. They lived together because they could not, by the metrics of institutional marriage, continue to be married, but they could, by the metrics of long friendship, continue to share a house. The less generous interpretation is that the arrangement reflected Andrew's particular psychological pattern with women. He had not, by the structure of the cohabitation, fully relinquished Sarah. He had divorced her by the institutional pressure that the post-1992 photographs had produced, but he had not separated from her in the practical reality of his domestic life. The pattern was characteristic. Andrew, throughout his life, had difficulty with the kind of full institutional commitment that conventional adult relationships required. He could form attachments. He could maintain attachments across long periods. He could not, in the conventional sense, fully marry the women he formed attachments to, and he could not, when conventional marriage failed, fully end the attachments. The cohabitation with Sarah after the divorce was, by this interpretation, the visible expression of his particular relational pattern. The two interpretations are not entirely exclusive. Both probably contain some truth. The arrangement worked for both of them in some practical sense. Sarah had, after 1996, the residential security that the cohabitation provided. Andrew had, after 1996, the domestic continuity that the cohabitation provided. The institutional convenience of the arrangement was, for both of them, sufficient to sustain it across 3 decades of changing circumstances. What the arrangement also produced, in the daily reality of the household at Royal Lodge across the late 1990s and the 2000s, was the conditions inside which Andrew's other relational patterns operated. He was not, in any conventional sense, a single man during this period. He was also not, in any conventional sense, a married man. He occupied the institutional space between the two categories. He used the space, by every account that has been preserved from the period, to conduct relationships with other women that the formal end of his marriage had made institutionally permissible, while the cohabitation with Sarah preserved a domestic continuity. The relationships were, in this period, varied in their seriousness and their public visibility. Some were brief social associations of the kind that senior royal men of his generation typically conducted without producing public scandal. Some were more sustained. None of them, between 1996 and the early 2010s, produced the kind of public crisis that would have forced him into the conventional adjustments most divorced senior royals had been required to make. The relationships also included, beginning sometime in the late 1990s, the friendship that would eventually destroy his public life. The friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. Andrew met Jeffrey Epstein in the late 1990s. The exact date of their first meeting has been the subject of ongoing reconstruction across the subsequent decades. Andrew, in his various public statements, has typically dated the friendship to approximately 1999. Andrew Lowney's biography, drawing on the cumulative documentary record, claims the friendship began earlier, by 1998 at the latest, with the possibility that the introduction had occurred even earlier than that. The differential matters because the earlier date overlaps with periods of Epstein's conduct that the later date would have placed Andrew safely outside. Epstein, by the late 1990s, was already operating the trafficking network that would eventually, in 2008, produce his first conviction for soliciting prostitution from a minor, and that would, in 2019, produce his second arrest on federal charges of sex trafficking. The network was operating during the years Andrew was developing his friendship with Epstein. The network involved the systematic recruitment of underage girls and young women, primarily from disadvantaged backgrounds, who were trafficked to Epstein's properties for the sexual use of Epstein himself and the various men in his social circle. The system was sophisticated. The system had been operating for some time before Andrew became friends with the man at the center of it. Andrew, by his own subsequent denials, did not know about the system. He has maintained in every statement he has produced about the friendship since 2010 that he did not participate in the system, did not witness the system, and was not aware that the system existed. The denials have been the foundation of his legal and reputational defense across the subsequent decades. The denials have been increasingly difficult to sustain in light of the documentary record that has accumulated about the friendship and its specific dimensions. What the documentary record shows, in summary, is the following. Andrew was friends with Epstein for over a decade. He visited Epstein's properties on multiple occasions, including the New York mansion, the Florida residence, and the private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands known as Little St. James. He attended social events at Epstein's properties at which young women were present. He maintained the friendship after Epstein's 2008 conviction, a fact that has been particularly difficult for Andrew's defenders to explain. He was photographed walking with Epstein in Central Park in December 2010, after Epstein had served his prison sentence and registered as a sex offender. He has explained the December 2010 photograph by saying that he had visited Epstein specifically to end the friendship. The explanation has been treated by most subsequent observers as not particularly credible. The visit had lasted 4 days. The photograph showed the two men walking together in apparent friendly conversation. The framing of the visit as a farewell visit was the framing Andrew adopted only after the photograph had become public and had begun producing the press scrutiny that the friendship would, from that point forward, attract. The trafficking victims of the Epstein network are the women this documentary is in significant part about. The number of women involved in the network has never been precisely established. The federal investigations and the various civil proceedings that have followed Epstein's 2019 arrest have identified, by various estimates, somewhere between dozens and hundreds of victims. The victims were, in most cases, young women from disadvantaged backgrounds, runaways, girls from broken families, girls who had been recruited by the network through promises of legitimate employment or modeling opportunities. They had been brought into Epstein's circle and used. The using had, in many cases, included sexual contact with men in Epstein's social network as well as with Epstein himself. The most prominent of these women, in terms of the public record, is Virginia Roberts Giuffre. She had been born in 1983. She had encountered the Epstein network in 2000 when she was 16 years old, working at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida as a locker room attendant. Ghislaine Maxwell had recruited her there with promises of a job as a massage therapist. The recruitment was the standard pattern. The job was not what the recruitment had presented it as. Virginia, within weeks, had been incorporated into the trafficking network and was being used in the way the network used the young women it recruited. She was, by her own subsequent account, trafficked to Andrew on 3 occasions. The first occasion, by her account, occurred in March 2001 at Ghislaine Maxwell's London townhouse. She was 17 years old. The second and third occasions, by her account, occurred at Epstein's New York mansion and at Little St. James, the private island. The accounts have been preserved in court documents from the civil case Virginia eventually filed against Andrew in 2021, in her posthumous memoir Nobody's Girl, published in October 2025, and in the various interviews she gave across the decade preceding her death. Andrew has denied her allegations. He has denied them since 2014 when she first publicly named him. He has denied them in interviews. He has denied them in court filings. He continued to deny them after the 2022 settlement, even as he acknowledged in the settlement statement that Virginia had been an established victim of abuse and that he regrets his association with Epstein. The pattern of his denials, across the 11 years between her first public allegation and her death in April 2025, was the pattern that the staff who served him recognized from the rest of his life. The denials had the quality of his other dismissals. The trafficking victim was, by Andrew's framework, the wrong kind of person to be making allegations about him. She was below his social position. She was making claims that, by the framework he had operated within his entire life, the institution of which he was a senior member would not be required to take seriously. He had absorbed from his earliest years the conviction that women below his social position would not, in any meaningful sense, be able to extract accountability from him for his treatment of them. The conviction had served him for 60 years. It would not finally serve him in the case of Virginia Giuffre. The case was different from his earlier patterns in several specific respects. Virginia had refused to disappear in the way other women had disappeared. She had pursued the accountability across more than a decade, despite the institutional pressure that had been applied to her at every stage. She had produced the photographic evidence that had in particular made the denials increasingly difficult to sustain. She had developed through the long pursuit the kind of public profile that Andrew's denial machinery could not in the end fully neutralize. She had also lived. The trafficking network had killed many of its victims in various direct and indirect ways. Virginia had survived. The survival had given her, across the years of her pursuit, the capacity to produce the public testimony that the system had been organized to prevent. The testimony had, by the time she had completed it, been sufficient to drive Andrew out of public life and eventually out of his royal title. In the part that follows, we move from the marriage to the bullying years. The decade of documented staff abuse that the Loney biography has, in 2025, finally made part of the public record. The Hillsborough Castle incident, the teddy bear arrangement, the mole on the staff member's face, the nylon tie, the pattern that the household at Royal Lodge had been absorbing for 40 years, and that the institution had decided with the same considered consistency it brought to all of its decisions about senior royals, not to address. Because the entitlement that produced the conduct toward Sarah Ferguson and toward the women in his orbit also produced the conduct toward the staff who served him. The dimensions were continuous. The same Andrew who had not in any conventional sense fully separated from his ex-wife was the same Andrew who could not in any conventional sense treat the people who worked for him with the standard of professional regard that other employers extended to their staff. The pattern was integrated. The integration is what the next part will examine. There is a category of staff treatment that operates below the threshold of formal complaint and above the threshold of ordinary professional friction. The category is specific. It includes the kinds of conduct that staff members will describe to their friends, that they will think about for years afterward, that they will eventually mention in retirement memoirs or to biographers conducting interviews, but that they will not, while the principal is still in a position to retaliate, formally report. The conduct does not rise to the level of clear professional misconduct that would require institutional response. It also does not fall to the level of ordinary frustration that staff in any demanding role absorb without remembering. It occupies the middle space that, in the operational reality of difficult employers, produces most of the actual damage. Andrew, by every account that has been preserved across decades and that has, in 2025, been comprehensively documented in Andrew Loney's biography entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, occupied this middle space with unusual consistency. The conduct has been documented across 40 years of his royal career, from the early 1980s through to the conclusion of his public role in 2019. The documentation is now extensive enough to allow the pattern to be examined as a coherent feature of his working life rather than as a series of isolated incidents. The pattern can be examined through specific cases, The cases are useful because they provide the granular detail that the broader characterization requires. Each case in itself is small. The cumulative weight of the cases across 40 years produces the picture this part of the documentary is built around. Begin with Hillsborough Castle in 2005. Hillsborough Castle is the official residence of the British monarch in Northern Ireland. It is a working royal residence used by senior members of the family during their visits to the province, and it is staffed by a permanent household that maintains the property between royal visits. In July 2005, Andrew was in residence at Hillsborough. The head of the household at the time was a man named David Anderson. Anderson had been at Hillsborough for some years. He was, by every available account, a competent professional who managed the household's operations with the kind of quiet efficiency that royal residences require. A storm had passed through the Hillsborough grounds in the days before Andrew's visit. The storm had damaged a tree on the property, specifically a tree that had been planted by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother had died 3 years earlier, in 2002. The tree she had planted was by 2005 a memorial to her in addition to being a feature of the Hillsborough grounds. The storm had damaged it. Anderson approached Andrew to inform him about the damage to the tree. In doing so, Anderson referred to the woman who had planted the tree as the Queen Mother. This was the conventional way to refer to Queen Elizabeth in the years after her death. The Queen Mother, the title she had been known by during her widowhood, the title that had been used in the official mourning materials that the institution had produced after her death. It was in 2005 the standard reference. It was the reference any reasonable head of household would have used when speaking to a member of the family about a memorial tree on their property. Andrew took offense. By Loney's account, drawing on Anderson's subsequent recollection of the incident, Andrew turned to face his head of household, and with eyes like George III said, "By who?" Anderson, having already used the standard reference, repeated himself. He said that the tree had been planted by the Queen Mother. Andrew, by Loney's reconstruction, then produced the response that the incident has become known for. "You ficking imbecile, get out." The response is preserved in Loney's book in those words. The biographer has been clear about the source, Anderson himself, recalling the incident in the years afterward, with the kind of specific detail that distinguishes recollection from invention. Anderson had been called a fucking imbecile in his own residence by a senior member of the royal family for the offence of using the standard institutional reference for the principal's own grandmother. The offence Andrew took, by every reasonable retrospective examination, had no genuine basis. The Queen Mother had been, since her death, the standard reference for the woman in question. Anderson had used the standard reference. The use was not in any honest sense an error. Andrew had identified an error that did not exist, and had used the identification as the occasion for verbal abuse of a senior member of his own staff. The pattern is the pattern. The principal identifies a small failing in the staff member. The failing does not on examination exist. The identification is the pretext for the abuse. The abuse follows. The staff member absorbs it, because the institutional structure of royal service requires the absorption. The principal moves on. The staff member, who cannot move on with comparable speed, carries the incident forward in the kind of permanent professional memory that produces, 20 years later, the testimony that Loney would eventually preserve. Anderson absorbed the incident. He did not, by any record that has been preserved, formally complain. He did not resign in protest. He continued in his role, serving the senior members of the royal family who visited Hillsborough across the subsequent years, performing the institutional work that his position required of him. He carried the memory of having been called a fucking imbecile by a senior royal in his own residence for using the standard reference. He carried it for 20 years before he gave the account to Loney that allowed the incident to enter the documentary record. This is what the absorbing looks like in practice. It is not formal. It is not visible to the institutional accountability mechanisms that other employers operate under. It happens in private. It accumulates across decades. It produces, in the staff who absorb it, the kind of permanent professional memory that the institution had been counting on the staff to keep private, and that, eventually, the staff have decided not to keep private any longer. The Hillsborough incident is one of many. Loney's book documents others. A diplomat had been visiting one of the royal residences for an official meeting with Andrew. The meeting had begun. Andrew at some point during the meeting had stepped away briefly. While he was away from the dining table, the diplomat had also stepped away, perhaps to use a bathroom, perhaps for some other ordinary reason that the diplomat was not in any sense required to explain. When the diplomat returned, his place setting and his chair had been removed. Andrew had returned to the dining table during the diplomat's absence and, by Loney's account, removed his place setting and chair, everything, because he knew his position of power, and they couldn't really respond. The diplomat could not respond. The diplomat was a guest in a royal residence for a working meeting. The diplomat could not, by the institutional codes of diplomatic visits, demand the restoration of his place at the table. The diplomat could not raise the issue with anyone in a position to resolve it. The diplomat had been, in the small specific way the incident reveals, humiliated by the senior royal he was meeting with. The humiliation had been the point. Andrew had identified an opportunity to demonstrate in a small ceremonial way the absolute power of his position over the diplomats. He had taken the opportunity. The diplomat, by the institutional codes of the meeting, had been required to absorb it. Loney's documented account of this incident drew the conclusion that the conduct revealed something specific about Andrew's pattern. The conduct was not random. The conduct was not, by any honest assessment, the kind of unfortunate isolated lapse that any professional figure occasionally produces. The conduct was deliberate, in the sense that Andrew had chosen to perform it, and patterned, in the sense that it fit the larger framework of his interaction with people he considered subordinate. He used his position. He took advantage of it. The phrase "took advantage" is the phrase Loney uses, and it captures the specific dimension of the conduct that distinguishes it from ordinary inadvertent unkindness. The pattern continued across the decades. A former aide had been reduced to tears after being bawled at in a phone call before dawn because Andrew was unhappy with a story in the Sun newspaper. The aide had not written the story. The aide had not, in any sense that would justify the conduct, been responsible for the story. Andrew had been displeased with the story. Andrew had decided that the aide was the appropriate target for the displeasure. The phone call had occurred at an hour that produced maximum disruption to the aide's life. The bawling had been sufficient to produce tears in the aide. The pattern was the pattern. The principal's displeasure required a target. The target was always selected from among the people who could not, by their structural position, refuse the role. The selection of staff members for dismissal on grounds that did not, in any rational assessment, justify dismissal was another feature of the pattern. One member of staff was moved to other duties because Andrew disliked a mole on the man's face, another because the man was wearing a nylon tie. The two examples are preserved in Loney's book in the language of the witnesses who reported them. They are small. They are also, in the way that small incidents reveal larger patterns, completely diagnostic. A staff member with a mole on his face was reassigned because the principal disliked the mole. The mole had not been chosen by the staff member. The mole had not interfered in any sense with the staff member's professional performance. The principal had simply decided that the mole was sufficient justification for adjusting the staff member's role to remove him from direct contact with the principal. The decision was the principal's prerogative. The staff member, by the institutional codes of Royal Household Service, could not appeal it. The staff member's professional life was adjusted accordingly. The principal, in making the adjustment, had asserted the prerogative his position gave him to determine which faces were acceptable in his vicinity. The nylon tie case is structurally identical. A staff member had worn a nylon tie. Nylon ties were, by the standards of British aristocratic clothing preferences in the period, a slightly less prestigious option than silk ties. The choice of a nylon tie did not in any rational sense indicate professional inadequacy. It indicated at most a slight differential in the staff member's available financial resources or his personal preferences in clothing. The principal had decided that the differential was unacceptable. The staff member was reassigned. The decision was again the principal's prerogative. The staff member again could not appeal. These are small cases. The smallness is part of what makes them diagnostic. The principal who can fire staff for moles and nylon ties is a principal whose framework for managing his household has detached from any reasonable proportionality between offense and consequence. The framework is purely about the principal's preferences. The staff are required to conform to the preferences regardless of how arbitrary or trivial the preferences turn out to be. The framework is the framework of pure entitlement. It operates without the standard checks that adult professional environments typically operate under. A specific case from the Royal Lodge household captures the pattern in its most distilled form. Charlotte Biggs was a maid at Royal Lodge. She had been hired to perform the standard duties of a senior royal household maid: the cleaning, the organizing of personal items, the small daily tasks that maintained the residence in the condition the principal required. Among her duties was the maintenance of Andrew's collection of teddy bears. The teddy bear collection requires its own paragraph of explanation. Andrew, in his late middle age, kept a substantial collection of teddy bears in his bedroom at Royal Lodge. The collection was arranged on his bed in a specific configuration. The configuration was, by the household's understanding, a pyramid. The bears had to be arranged with the smallest at the top and the larger ones at the base, in the kind of careful geometric structure that indicated that the arrangement mattered to the principal at a level beyond the conventional adult relationship to childhood toys. Charlotte Biggs, when she arrived at Royal Lodge, was given training on how to arrange the teddy bears. She received, by her own subsequent recollection to the Daily Mirror, a day's training specifically on the teddy bear arrangement. As soon as I got the job, I was told about the teddies, and it was drilled into me how he wanted them. I even had a day's training. Everything had to be just right. It was so peculiar. The maid's account contains the word peculiar. The word is doing significant work. The maid was not, by her presentation in the Daily Mirror interview, attempting to mock Andrew. She was reporting what the household had been like for the staff who worked inside it. The teddy bears had to be arranged correctly. Incorrect arrangement produced consequences. The consequences had been sufficient that her training had included a full day on this single task. Other tasks presumably had received less training. The teddy bears were the priority. The peculiarity is the diagnostic feature. A senior member of the British royal family in his 50s and 60s and 70s had organized his household around the precise arrangement of his teddy bear collection. The maid had been required to learn the arrangement. The principal had been displeased when the arrangement was incorrect. The household, in its structural organization, had absorbed the priority and had elevated the teddy bears to a level of operational importance that no rational assessment of household priorities would have produced. The bowing requirement was another feature of the household's daily operation. Loney's book documents that Andrew expected staff to bow when he entered a room. The bowing was the standard royal requirement for direct interactions with senior members of the family. It was, in the conventional protocols of British royal service, the appropriate physical acknowledgement of the principal's status. Most senior royals, by the late 20th century, had relaxed the strict enforcement of the requirement in private settings. The bowing was performed at formal occasions. In private interactions with staff, the requirement was typically waived in favor of the more functional working relationships that ordinary household operations required. Andrew did not waive the requirement. Loney documents that Andrew, when staff failed to bow on his entry to a room, would re-enter the room and require the staff to perform the bow correctly. The re-entry was the diagnostic feature. The principal had decided that the absence of the bow was unacceptable. The principal had decided that the staff member's recovery, the bow performed after the principal had already entered, was insufficient. The principal had decided that the only acceptable resolution was the staging of a fresh entry, in which the staff member would have the opportunity to perform the bow correctly from the beginning. The fresh entry was performed. The staff member bowed. The principal accepted the bow. The interaction continued. What this revealed about Andrew's framework, in retrospective examination, was the specific quality of his relationship to the institutional protocols his position involved. Most senior royals operated the protocols with a degree of personal discretion. The protocols were, in their formal definition, demanding. The personal discretion involved relaxing the demands in private settings, in informal moments, in the kinds of daily interactions where rigid enforcement would have produced household dysfunction. Andrew did not operate with the discretion. He operated the protocols at their maximum level of demand. He required the bowing every time. He required the corrections when the bowing failed. He produced across his household the kind of rigid daily insistence on hierarchical formalities that other senior royals had long since abandoned. The cumulative effect of the pattern across the staff who absorbed it was the working environment that the various subsequent disclosures have described. The staff did not, by every available indication, enjoy working for Andrew. They served because the position offered the prestige and the institutional benefits that royal household service typically offered. They absorbed the difficulties because the absorbing was the job. They did not, by their professional culture, formally complain. They moved on when the absorbing became impossible, by transitioning into other roles or by leaving royal service entirely. The institutional response to the pattern, across the 4 decades of its operation, was the pattern this documentary has been describing in earlier sections. The palace had been aware of the conduct. The reports had reached the senior courtiers whose responsibilities included the management of staff issues across the royal household. The reports had not produced institutional intervention. The non-intervention had been the standard institutional response to staff issues involving senior royals, and it had been applied to Andrew with the same considered consistency it had been applied to his father, his sister, his grandmother, and the various other senior figures whose conduct towards staff had produced similar issues across the same period. What changed eventually was the conditions under which the absorbing could continue. In 2021, by Loney's account, the royal family held a summit specifically to discuss Andrew's conduct. The summit had been convened by senior figures of the family. The exact composition has not been publicly confirmed, but the participants included, by various accounts, the Queen, Prince Charles, then Prince of Wales, and senior household courtiers whose responsibilities included the management of family discipline issues. The summit had been called because the cumulative weight of the issues surrounding Andrew, the staff conduct, the Epstein scandal, the public reputation problems that had accelerated since the 2019 Newsnight interview, had reached a level that the family could no longer ignore. The summit, by Loney's account, reached a specific conclusion. There was no way back for him to find his place in the monarchy. The conclusion was institutional. The family had decided that Andrew, regardless of any future modifications in his conduct, could not be returned to the position of working senior royal that he had occupied before the Epstein scandal had accelerated. The decision was significant. It marked the moment at which the institution had finally accepted what the staff had known for 40 years, that the figure they had been protecting was not, by any reasonable institutional accounting, a figure who could be permanently sustained inside the working royal family. The decision did not immediately produce the public consequences that 2025 would eventually produce. The family was still operating in 2021 under the working assumption that the institutional protection of senior royals was the standard institutional response, and that the protection of Andrew in some attenuated form would continue. The conclusion that there was no way back was a private conclusion, communicated within the family and to the senior courtiers who needed to know it, but not communicated externally and not in 2021, producing the public actions that would, eventually in 2025, finally be produced. The 4 years between the 2021 summit and the October 2025 stripping of titles were the years in which the public pressure built sufficiently to require the private conclusion to become a public action. The pressure built through the continuing accumulation of disclosures about Andrew's conduct. It built through the revelations about his finances, the £12 million Giuffre settlement, the questions about how the settlement had been funded, the related questions about Andrew's lifestyle expenses. It built through Virginia Giuffre's continuing public testimony, through the documentary projects she was involved with, through her work toward the memoir that would eventually be published in October 2025. It built through her death in April 2025, which had produced the kind of permanent moral weight that the institution could not, in the months that followed, continue to ignore. The institutional non-intervention that had operated for 40 years finally ended in October 2025. The action came when the public pressure had become greater than the institutional pressure to maintain the protection. The action would not have come without the public pressure. The public pressure would not have built without the disclosures. The disclosures had, in turn, depended on the work of biographers like Loney, journalists like the ones who had pursued the Epstein story across the decades, and most importantly, the women who had refused to disappear in the way the institution had been counting on them to disappear. In the part that follows, we move to the period of Andrew's life that produced some of the most distinctive features of his public reputation outside of the Epstein scandal. The years from 2001 to 2011, when he served as the United Kingdom's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment, the position that allowed him to travel constantly at public expense, the friendships with autocrats, the Fabergé egg requested at a meeting with the Azerbaijani government, the £15 million sale of his house to a Kazakh oligarch in 2007, the pattern that, across the decade of the trade envoy role, became known in the British press as Air Miles Andy. Because the trade envoy years were the years in which Andrew's particular pattern of using his royal position for personal financial advantage became visible in ways that the institution had not previously been required to confront. The pattern would eventually contribute to his 2011 resignation from the role. The pattern would also, in retrospect, be visible as part of the larger framework that had produced his Epstein friendship. The two patterns shared a common foundation: the conviction that his royal position entitled him to forms of financial benefit that other people of his station did not accept, and that the institution he served did not, in its public posture, endorse. Just a thing come into my mind. Tell us in the comments where you are from. Also, if you like this documentary, please consider subscribing. The position was created for him. This is the foundational fact about the role he occupied for 10 years, and it is the fact that subsequent retrospective examination of the role has had the most difficulty fully accounting for. The United Kingdom's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment had not existed as a defined institutional position before Andrew was appointed to it in 2001. The position was constructed around him. The construction had been undertaken by the British government of the period, in cooperation with the palace, to provide Andrew with a substantive role in his post-naval life that would give him something to do with the considerable energy and the considerable institutional access that his royal position provided. The Royal Navy career, which he had begun in 1979, formally ended in 2001. He retired with the rank of commander. The career had been, by the standards of senior naval officers of his generation, respectable but not particularly distinguished. He had served. He had performed his duties. He had reached the ranks his service had earned him. He had not, in the post-Falklands decades, produced the kind of additional achievements that would have justified extended naval service into senior flag officer ranks. The retirement in 2001, at age 41, was in line with the natural conclusion of a successful but not exceptional naval career. The question after the retirement was the question that had been waiting since the Falklands. What would he do with the rest of his life? The conventional options for a senior royal of his position in the early 2000s were several. He could have taken on the patronages and charitable engagements that constituted the standard working role of senior royals, the kind of role his sister Anne had been performing at the rate of 500 engagements a year since the late 1960s. He could have pursued a private business career, in the way that some senior aristocratic figures of his generation had done. He could have retreated into the quiet country life that other royals had constructed in their post-active periods. He did not pursue any of these conventional options, or rather, he pursued aspects of all of them. He held some patronages, he developed some private business interests, he maintained his country residence at Sunninghill Park. But the central focus of his post-naval public life became the trade envoy role. The role had, on its institutional face, a defensible purpose. The British government in the early 2000s was actively pursuing trade and investment opportunities with countries around the world, including countries whose governments were difficult to engage through conventional diplomatic channels. The Foreign Office had concluded that there were countries, particularly in Central Asia and the Middle East, where access to the senior figures of government required the kind of high-level personal engagement that ordinary Foreign Office representatives could not always provide. A senior member of the British royal family, travelling to these countries with the explicit institutional purpose of supporting British trade and investment interests, could in theory provide the kind of access that the Foreign Office was seeking. This was the institutional rationale. The rationale was not in itself unreasonable. Other countries used their senior figures in similar ways. The use of royal access to support commercial diplomacy was a recognized feature of how monarchies typically deployed their resources in the modern world. What complicated the rationale in Andrew's specific case was the question of his personal conduct in the role, and the question of how the institutional purpose interacted with his particular pattern of personal entitlement. The countries Andrew traveled to most frequently across the decade of the trade envoy role were, with notable consistency, countries whose governments were authoritarian, whose human rights records were poor, and whose senior figures were the kinds of people that conventional diplomatic engagement had to handle with particular care: Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Libya, before the 2011 collapse of the Gaddafi regime, Tunisia, before the 2011 revolution that ended the Ben Ali government, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates. The list of his most frequent destinations reads, in retrospective examination, like an inventory of the regimes that the British Foreign Office was, across the same period, trying to manage rather than endorse. Andrew, by every account that has been preserved from the period, did not approach these regimes with the institutional caution that the Foreign Office's broader posture would have required. He approached them, rather, with the personal warmth that his particular framework of relationships made available. He developed friendships with the autocratic rulers of these countries. He stayed in their palaces. He attended their family weddings. He absorbed, from these regimes, the kinds of small institutional gifts and gestures that other senior figures of his generation, attentive to the implications, declined to absorb. The Fabergé egg case is the specific instance that has, in subsequent press coverage, become the iconic illustration of the pattern. As Britain's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment from 2001 to 2011, Andrew, according to Loney, was not afraid to ask for gifts at meetings with heads of state and government from Azerbaijan, Libya and Tunisia, including on one occasion a Fabergé egg. The Fabergé egg request needs to be examined with full directness, because the request reveals a feature of Andrew's framework that other documentation of the period had been hinting at, without quite making explicit. He asked for the egg. The host government, which had been hosting him on official British trade business, had not offered the egg. The egg was not part of the standard institutional gift exchange that state visits typically involve. The egg was, by the framework of standard diplomatic protocol, not the kind of item that visiting senior figures asked for. Andrew asked. The host government, which by the institutional codes of dealing with senior British royals could not refuse the request without producing a diplomatic incident, complied. The compliance was the significant feature. The autocratic governments Andrew was visiting were governments that operated, in their own institutional cultures, on the basis of personal patronage and gift-giving as standard tools of relationship management. The asking of gifts by visiting senior figures was, in their framework, not entirely unfamiliar. They could absorb the requests within their existing systems for managing such requests. The compliance produced, on their side, the kind of diplomatic credit they were attempting to accumulate with the British government. Andrew, on his side, accumulated the gifts. The Fabergé egg was one specific instance. The broader pattern, across the decade of the trade envoy role, included other gifts of substantial value, not all of which have been individually documented, but the cumulative pattern of which has been described by various subsequent investigators and journalists. He left these meetings, across the decade, with materially more than he had brought to them. The institutional framework of the trade envoy role had not anticipated this accumulation. The framework had assumed that Andrew would pursue British trade interests on behalf of British companies. The reality was that Andrew was, in significant measure, pursuing his own personal interests in the kinds of personal accumulations that the autocratic governments were willing to provide in exchange for the access his royal position represented. The Sunninghill Park case is the most documented financial transaction of the period. Sunninghill Park was the country house Andrew and Sarah had received from the Queen as a wedding present in 1986. The property, located in Berkshire near Windsor, had been built specifically for them. The original house on the site had been demolished, and a new one constructed on the property to the design specifications the couple had requested. The construction had cost the Crown approximately £5 million in 1986 money. The house had been the family's principal residence during the early years of the marriage, and had remained Andrew's residence after the 1992 separation and the 1996 divorce. In 2007, Andrew put Sunninghill Park on the market. He listed it for £12 million. The house had, by some property assessments at the time, been overvalued at the listing price. Comparable properties in the same area had been selling for less, and the British property market in 2007 was beginning to show the early signs of the downturn that would, by 2008, become the global financial crisis. Several months passed without serious offers approaching the asking price. Then a buyer emerged. The buyer was a Kazakh oligarch named Timur Kulibayev. Kulibayev was the son-in-law of the Kazakh president Nursultan Nazarbayev, the long-serving authoritarian leader whose government Andrew had been engaging with through the trade envoy role. Kulibayev offered £15 million for Sunninghill Park. The offer was £3 million over the asking price. There were no other competitive bidders. The transaction proceeded. Andrew in 2007 sold his house for £15 million to a Kazakh oligarch with direct family connections to the head of state of a country he had been visiting in his trade envoy capacity. The transaction has, across the years that followed, been the subject of considerable subsequent investigation. The investigations have not in any conclusive way identified illegal conduct in the transaction. The transaction was, in its formal legal dimensions, a private property sale between two willing parties at a price both parties had agreed to. The legal framework of property transactions in the United Kingdom did not in 2007 require buyers to justify the prices they were willing to pay for properties they wanted to acquire. What the investigations have identified, however, is the substantial gap between the £15 million Kulibayev paid for Sunninghill and the value the property could have been expected to reach in a normal market transaction. The gap, by various retrospective assessments, was somewhere between £3 million and £5 million. The gap raised the obvious question of why a foreign oligarch with family connections to a foreign head of state had been willing to pay several £million above market value for a property that had no particular distinguishing features that would have justified the premium. The question has never been formally answered. The investigations have not produced documentary evidence of corrupt intent. Andrew has not in any public statement addressed the substance of the question. The transaction has remained on the public record as one of the unresolved features of the trade envoy decade, a transaction that did not on its face produce illegal conduct, but that did produce the kind of pattern that any reasonable observer would have identified as the possible result of relationships that had moved past the institutional purpose the trade envoy role had been designed to serve. The British press began to develop the institutional posture toward Andrew that would, by the late 2000s, become the dominant framing of his public role. The posture was captured by the nickname Air Miles Andy. The nickname referred to the volume of international travel Andrew was conducting in the trade envoy role, much of it on private aircraft, much of it at public expense, and much of it directed at destinations that the conventional reading of British trade priorities would not have placed at the top of any working list. The nickname was mocking. The mocking was sustained. By 2010, the press had decided that Andrew was a figure whose public role was not justifying its costs, and whose personal pattern within the role was producing the kind of repeated small embarrassments that the institution he was serving could not indefinitely continue to absorb. The pressure on his position accelerated in early 2011. A series of newspaper investigations, conducted across the British and American press, produced increasingly detailed coverage of Andrew's friendships with figures whose backgrounds the trade envoy role had not, by its institutional logic, been designed to engage with. The coverage included specific reporting on the Saif al-Islam Gaddafi connection. Andrew had developed a personal relationship with the son of the Libyan dictator before the 2011 Libyan civil war, a relationship that the war and the subsequent collapse of the Gaddafi regime had made increasingly difficult to defend. The coverage included specific reporting on the relationship with the Azerbaijani president Ilham Aliyev. The coverage included specific reporting on the Kulibayev transaction. The coverage included by mid-2011 the developing reporting on the friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. The Epstein reporting in the early 2011 period was not yet at the level of intensity it would reach after Epstein's 2019 arrest. Epstein had been convicted in 2008 of soliciting prostitution from a minor and had served his prison sentence. He had been registered as a sex offender. The friendship between Andrew and Epstein had survived Epstein's conviction. Andrew had visited Epstein at his New York mansion in December 2010 in the 4-day visit that the December 2010 Central Park photograph had documented. The visit had begun to attract press attention by early 2011. The press had begun by mid-2011 to question why a senior British royal was maintaining a personal friendship with a registered American sex offender. The cumulative weight of the various press investigations across the first half of 2011 made Andrew's continuation in the trade envoy role institutionally unsustainable. The British government by the summer of 2011 had concluded that the role could not continue. Andrew, on the 21st of July 2011, formally resigned. The resignation was managed with the kind of institutional discretion that allowed both Andrew and the government to avoid direct acknowledgement of the underlying reasons for the resignation. The official statement framed the departure as a routine transition. The reality, by every account that has been preserved from the period, was that Andrew had been removed from the role under pressure that he could not, by any institutional response available to him, resist. The trade envoy decade had produced, by the time of his resignation, the public reputation that would carry him into the deeper crises of the next decade. He was a senior royal whose pattern of personal accumulation through his royal position had become visible enough to attract sustained press scrutiny. He was a figure whose friendships with foreign autocrats had been established and documented. He was the man who had sold his house for £15 million to a Kazakh oligarch under circumstances that had not been satisfactorily explained. He was the figure who, even after the conviction of Jeffrey Epstein for sex offenses against a minor in 2008, had continued the friendship with Epstein and had been photographed with him in 2010. Each of these features of his public reputation, in 2011, was a feature that previous generations of senior royals had typically managed to avoid through some combination of institutional discretion and personal restraint. Andrew had managed to avoid none of them. The cumulative effect by 2011 was a senior royal whose institutional value had begun to net negative, whose continued presence in any working royal capacity was, by the institutional accounting that the palace conducted on these matters, producing more reputational damage than the work he was performing could justify. The palace's response to this institutional accounting in 2011 was to reduce his working role rather than to remove him from it entirely. He gave up the trade envoy position. He continued to perform some patronages and some public engagements. He retained his rank as a senior royal in the family's public hierarchy. The full removal that would eventually come in October 2025 was not, in 2011, institutionally available. The Queen was still alive. The Queen was still institutionally protective of her favoured son. The reduction of his role, rather than the elimination of it, was the institutional compromise that the 2011 conditions had produced. The compromise would not hold for very long. The Epstein friendship, which had been one of the secondary issues in the 2011 institutional accounting, would become the primary issue in the institutional accounting that emerged after Epstein's 2019 arrest. The arrest, the subsequent suicide in his jail cell, the federal investigations that proceeded after his death, the civil cases that proliferated across the early 2020s, all of these would, in their cumulative effect, produce the institutional crisis that 2011's compromise had been attempting to avoid. In the part that follows, we move to the Epstein years specifically, the decade of friendship that Andrew has been attempting, since 2010, to redefine the actual record of the friendship, as it has been reconstructed across multiple investigative efforts. The trafficking network Epstein operated, the young women who were trafficked through it, Virginia Giuffre and the 3 encounters she has described in court documents and in her posthumous memoir, the settlement of February 2022, and the institutional reality that has emerged across the years, the reality that Andrew's defense of his conduct, sustained across more than a decade of denials, has not survived the cumulative documentary record that has been produced about it, because the trade envoy years had revealed Andrew's pattern with regimes. The Epstein years would reveal his pattern with women. The two patterns shared the common feature that this documentary has been examining throughout, the framework of entitlement that had been formed in his earliest years, and that had, across his life, been applied to whatever situations his royal position made available. The trade envoy framework had given him access to autocrats and to the financial benefits autocratic governments could provide. The Epstein framework had given him access to the trafficking network and to the young women that Epstein and his associates had trafficked. The same Andrew, applying the same framework, had used both forms of access in the ways the framework had taught him to use them. The cost of the trade envoy framework had been primarily institutional. The British government had absorbed the cost. The British public had absorbed the cost. The British taxpayer, who had funded the trade envoy role at considerable expense across the decade, had absorbed the cost. The cost of the Epstein framework had been paid by women, by Virginia Giuffre, by the other trafficking victims of the network, by the decades of harm that the network had produced, and that Andrew, through his sustained friendship with the man at the center of the network, had been part of. This is the part of the story that requires the most careful handling. The handling will be careful. The substance, however, is what it is. The documentary has been working toward this part since the beginning. The part that follows is the one this documentary is finally about. There is a way of writing about the Epstein years that this documentary has to refuse, because it would be the easier way and it would not be the honest way. The easier way would be to focus on Andrew, to examine in granular detail the friendship Andrew maintained with Jeffrey Epstein, the specific dates and places, the photograph in Central Park in December 2010, the various denials Andrew has produced across the decades since 2010, the settlement of February 2022. The easier way would treat Andrew as the central figure and the women as the secondary figures whose presence in the story serves to illuminate his. This documentary will not do that. The central figures of this part are the women. Andrew is one of the men whose conduct affected their lives, but he is not the most important figure in the story of the trafficking network. The most important figures are the women who were trafficked through it. The most important figure, by the standards of who has had the most public impact on the institutional consequences that have eventually emerged, is Virginia Giuffre. The honest examination of the Epstein years has to begin with her and with the other women whose testimony has produced the documentary record we now have access to. Virginia Roberts was born on the 9th of August, 1983, in Sacramento, California. Her family moved to Florida when she was a child. The childhood she had was, by every account from her own subsequent testimony and from her family members who have spoken publicly, deeply difficult. She was abused as a child by an older male family acquaintance. She ran away from home as a teenager. She lived for periods on the street. She was, by the time she was 16 years old, exactly the kind of vulnerable young person that predatory networks target. The targeting was not random. The networks specifically sought out young women whose backgrounds had produced the kind of vulnerability that made them susceptible to recruitment. Virginia, with her history, fit the profile. She encountered the Epstein network in the summer of 2000 when she was 16. She was working at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach, Florida as a locker room attendant. The job was a minor service position. Ghislaine Maxwell, the British socialite who had been Epstein's principal partner in the operation of the trafficking network, approached Virginia at Mar-a-Lago. The approach was the standard recruitment approach the network used. Maxwell offered Virginia a job as a massage therapist. Maxwell told Virginia that she could be trained for the position. Maxwell told Virginia that the work would be lucrative and that the training would be provided. Virginia, who had no experience in massage therapy and who would, in the institutional reality of professional massage therapy work, not have been a credible candidate for such training, was taken to Epstein's Palm Beach mansion for what was framed as her first training session. The session was not in any sense a legitimate massage therapy training. It was the introduction to the trafficking network. The work she was being recruited for was the sexual servicing of Epstein himself and, as the network developed her involvement, of the various men in Epstein's social circle who had access to her through the network. She was 16 years old. She was, by the relevant legal standards in Florida and elsewhere, a child. The conduct she was being introduced to was, by the relevant legal standards, criminal. The men involved in the conduct were, by the relevant legal standards, committing serious crimes against a minor. Epstein had constructed the network to enable the crimes. Maxwell had recruited the victims who would be subjected to the crimes. The network had, by the time Virginia was recruited, been operating for some years and had processed a substantial number of young women through its mechanisms. Virginia was incorporated into the network across the second half of 2000 and the first half of 2001. The incorporation involved her removal from her ordinary life. She was housed at Epstein's properties, traveled with him on his private aircraft, was made financially dependent on him in ways that the recruitment had been designed to produce. She was, across this period, exactly the kind of vulnerable trafficking victim that anti-trafficking laws have been designed to identify and protect. The protections did not in 2000 and 2001 reach her. The network operated outside the structures that would have produced the protections. The men in the network, including Epstein himself and Ghislaine Maxwell and the various clients of the network, operated in the institutional protection that wealth and social position provided. Among the clients of the network, by Virginia's subsequent testimony, was Andrew. The first encounter by her account occurred in March 2001. She was 17 years old. She had been brought to London by Epstein and Maxwell. The encounter took place at Maxwell's London townhouse, located in the Belgravia area of central London. The townhouse was used by the network as one of its operational locations. Andrew, by Virginia's account, came to the townhouse. The introduction was facilitated by Maxwell. The encounter that followed was, by Virginia's account, sexual. The photograph that has become the iconic image of the case was taken during this encounter. The photograph shows Andrew with his arm around Virginia's waist. Maxwell is visible in the background of the photograph. Virginia in the image is 17 years old. Andrew in the image is 41. The photograph has been preserved in court documents and in subsequent press coverage of the case. The photograph is one of the central pieces of documentary evidence that Virginia's allegations were not invented and that the encounter in some form occurred. Andrew has, across the years that followed, attempted to question the authenticity of the photograph. He has suggested in various statements that the photograph might have been digitally manipulated. He has questioned why the original of the photograph has not been produced. The original photograph, by various accounts, was given by Virginia to the FBI in 2011 and has remained in their custody since. Copies have been published. The copies have been examined by photographic experts. The experts have not, in any of the public examinations conducted, identified evidence of manipulation. The photograph, by every reasonable assessment of the documentary record, is authentic. Andrew's approach to the photograph in the 2019 BBC Newsnight interview will be examined in the next part of this documentary. The approach was characteristic. He attempted in the interview to introduce alternative explanations for various features of the photograph, including the famous claim that he could not have been sweating in the way Virginia had described because of a medical condition that prevented him from sweating. The claims, when examined by the press in the days following the interview, were found to lack credibility. Andrew's denials about the photograph and the encounter it documented have not, across the years since 2014, achieved the kind of public acceptance that his denial machinery had been designed to produce. The second and third encounters Virginia described in her court testimony and her subsequent memoir occurred at other Epstein properties. The second encounter, by her account, took place at Epstein's New York mansion on East 71st Street. The third encounter took place at Little St. James, the private island Epstein owned in the United States Virgin Islands, where the network's most secure operational location was maintained. The accounts of these encounters have been preserved in the court filings of the 2021 civil case and in the posthumous memoir Virginia produced. Andrew has denied all three encounters. He has denied them since Virginia first publicly named him in court documents in 2014. He has denied them in interviews. He has denied them in court filings. He has continued to deny them after the 2022 settlement, even as the settlement statement included his acknowledgement that Virginia was an established victim of abuse and that he regrets his association with Epstein. The denials have been, in the broader assessment of the documentary record, increasingly difficult to sustain. The photograph from the first encounter is one piece of evidence. The flight logs from Epstein's private aircraft, which have been published in connection with the various legal proceedings that have followed Epstein's 2019 arrest, document Andrew's presence on the aircraft on dates that align with Virginia's account of the encounters. The visitor logs from Little St. James document Andrew's presence on the island. The documentary record, taken as a whole, is consistent with Virginia's account in ways that Andrew's account cannot, by any reasonable assessment, be reconciled with. What this documentary will not do is reconstruct the encounters in detail. The reconstruction is not what serves the truth at this point. The truth has been preserved in the court filings, in Virginia's memoir, in the various subsequent investigative accounts. Anyone who wants the granular detail can access it through these sources. What this documentary will preserve, instead, is the structural fact of the conduct and the cost. The conduct produced for the woman it was conducted against. Virginia survived the trafficking network. She was, by her own subsequent testimony, recruited away from the network in 2002 when she was 18 by a man named Robert Giuffre, an Australian martial arts instructor who had encountered her during one of the network's operations and who, by every account, helped her escape the network's grip. She married him. They moved to Australia together. They had 3 children. She built, across the next 2 decades of her life, the kind of stable family existence that the trafficking network had been organized to prevent young women like her from ever achieving. But she did not, across those 2 decades, leave the network behind. She had decided, sometime in the years following her escape, that the institutional protection the network had operated under needed to be challenged. The challenge would require her testimony. She began producing the testimony in 2009 when she contacted Florida prosecutors who were investigating Epstein. She produced more of the testimony across the years that followed. She named Andrew publicly for the first time in 2014. She filed her civil lawsuit against Andrew in August 2021. The lawsuit was filed in the Southern District of New York. The court filing alleged the 3 encounters described above. The filing alleged that Andrew had known Virginia was a minor at the time of the first encounter, that he had participated in the trafficking network's use of her, and that he was, in the legal terms relevant to the case, liable for damages. Andrew's defense was, in its initial form, the attempt to have the case dismissed. His lawyers argued that a 2009 settlement Virginia had reached with Epstein in a separate case had included a release that, by their interpretation, extended to Andrew and to other men in Epstein's social network. The 2009 settlement had been reached when Virginia was 25 years old and had received $500,000 from Epstein in compensation for the abuse she had suffered. The release, by Andrew's lawyer's interpretation, had named Epstein and any other person or entity who could have been included as a potential defendant. The interpretation held that Andrew, as a potential defendant in the broader Epstein litigation, was covered by the release. The court did not accept the interpretation. Judge Lewis Kaplan, in a ruling issued in January 2022, denied Andrew's motion to dismiss. The judge ruled that the language of the 2009 settlement was sufficiently ambiguous that the case could proceed against Andrew. The ruling cleared the path for the case to move toward trial. The trial, if it had occurred, would have required Andrew to provide testimony under oath. The deposition was scheduled for March 2022. The case did not proceed to deposition. On the 15th of February 2022, Andrew and Virginia announced an out-of-court settlement. The financial terms of the settlement were not disclosed in the official announcement. The settlement included a substantial donation by Andrew to Virginia's charity in support of victims' rights. The settlement included a statement, signed by both parties, in which Andrew regrets his association with Epstein and commends the bravery of Miss Giuffre and other survivors in standing up for themselves and others. The settlement amount has been, in subsequent reporting, estimated at approximately £12 million. The estimate has come from multiple sources, including the Daily Telegraph, which reported that the Queen had personally contributed approximately £2 million to Virginia's charity as part of the settlement. The remainder of the settlement amount, by various subsequent reports, was funded through a loan from then Prince Charles to Andrew, against the eventual sale of Andrew's Swiss chalet in Verbier. The Verbier chalet was sold in 2022. The proceeds, by various accounts, were used to repay the loan from Charles. The financial details of the settlement matter because they reveal the institutional reality of how Andrew's defense was funded. He did not, across the period of the case, have personal liquid assets sufficient to settle for the kind of figure the case required. He depended on his family's institutional resources. The Queen, who was still alive in 2022 and had been institutionally protective of him throughout her reign, contributed to the settlement. Charles, who would within months become king, provided the loan that funded the bulk of the settlement payment. The institution paid for Andrew's settlement. In the same general way the institution had paid for Andrew's life across his entire adult existence. The settlement statement included no admission of liability. Andrew's denial of Virginia's specific allegations remained, formally, intact. But the settlement also included the explicit acknowledgement that Virginia was an established victim of abuse. The acknowledgement was significant. Andrew, in agreeing to the settlement, had acknowledged the substantive truth of Virginia's general account, that she had been trafficked, that she had been abused, that she had suffered as a result of the trafficking. He had not acknowledged the specific allegations against him. He had, however, conceded the foundation that the specific allegations rested on. The settlement was, in the institutional accounting that the palace conducted on these matters, the conclusion of the immediate legal threat. It was not the conclusion of the reputational threat. The reputational threat would, across the years that followed, accelerate rather than diminish. The settlement payment did not produce the kind of public closure the institution had been hoping for. The British public, the international press, the various continuing investigations into the Epstein network, none of these had been closed by the settlement. They had instead been provided with new fuel. The new fuel arrived through Virginia herself. She had agreed to the settlement on terms that included a one-year period, during which both parties would refrain from public discussion of the case. The period concluded in February 2023. From that point forward, Virginia was free to continue her public testimony. She continued. She gave additional interviews. She participated in additional documentary projects. She began, in the months that followed, the work on the memoir that would eventually be published in 2025. The memoir was titled Nobody's Girl, a memoir of surviving abuse and fighting for justice. Virginia worked on it for more than 2 years. The work was extensive and, by every account from those who supported her through it, emotionally demanding. She was producing in the memoir the most comprehensive account of her experience that had ever been assembled. The account included her childhood. It included her recruitment. It included her years in the trafficking network. It included her escape. It included her 2 decades of pursuing the institutional accountability that her testimony had been designed to produce. The memoir also included, by every account from those who read advance copies, the most detailed account she had ever given of the encounters with Andrew. The account would be, when the memoir was published, the most comprehensive challenge yet produced to Andrew's denials. The memoir's publication was scheduled for October 2025. Virginia did not live to see the publication. On the 24th of April 2025, Virginia took her own life at her home in Western Australia. She was 41 years old. The cause of death was suicide. The circumstances surrounding the death have been the subject of some subsequent reconstruction. She had been, by the accounts of those close to her, struggling significantly in the months before her death. The struggles had multiple sources: the cumulative weight of 2 decades of testimony, the personal difficulties she had been managing in her marriage and family life, the chronic health issues she had been dealing with, including the long-term consequences of the abuse she had suffered as a young woman. The death was a tragedy by any reasonable assessment. It was also, in the broader institutional context, a tragedy that the network of men who had abused her had spent their decades attempting to prevent her from producing the testimony that her death had finally not stopped. The memoir she had completed before her death would be published. The testimony she had produced across her life would survive her. Her work, in the institutional sense, would continue to operate after she had stopped. Her brother, Sky Roberts, produced the family's public statement on her death. The statement included the acknowledgement that the family had lost one of its most courageous members. The statement also acknowledged what Virginia's death had not in any way undone. Today, an ordinary American girl from an ordinary American family brought down a British prince with her truth and extraordinary courage. The statement is significant. It frames Virginia's death and her life in the terms her family had decided to use. She had been an ordinary American girl. She had become, through her testimony, the woman who had brought down a British prince. The bringing down had not been complete at the time of her death. Andrew had not yet been stripped of his title, had not yet been evicted from Royal Lodge, had not yet been reduced to the institutional position he would eventually occupy. The completion would come 6 months later, in October 2025. Virginia would not live to see it. The completion would, in the institutional sense, be her work. The completion was what her testimony had been designed to produce. The memoir was published on the 21st of October 2025. The publication produced in the British press and the international press the kind of extensive coverage that comprehensive trafficking accounts tend to produce. The accounts of Andrew that the memoir contained were the most detailed Virginia had ever produced. The accounts were consistent with her previous testimony. The accounts added specific dimensions of the encounters that the previous testimony had not fully addressed. The accounts produced in the institutional accounting the palace had been conducting on these matters since the 2021 Family Summit, the final pressure that the institution had been attempting to absorb without responding to. The institution responded. On the 30th of October 2025, 9 days after the memoir's publication and approximately 6 months after Virginia's death, King Charles III stripped his brother of his prince title and initiated the eviction from Royal Lodge. The action was the institutional acknowledgement that the cumulative weight of Virginia's testimony, combined with the additional disclosures that had accumulated across the years since 2014, had finally exceeded what the institution could continue to absorb on Andrew's behalf. The action did not produce justice. Justice in the legal sense would have required a criminal prosecution that the institutional structure of British royal life had been designed to prevent. The action produced instead the institutional acknowledgement that the figure being protected had become for the institution more costly than he was worth. The institutional cost-benefit had finally tipped. The protection had ended. The figure would, from that point forward, be on his own. In the part that follows, we move to the moment that, in retrospect, did more than any other single event to make the protection eventually unsustainable. The November 2019 BBC Newsnight interview with Emily Maitlis. The interview Andrew agreed to do despite the unanimous advice of his press advisors that he should not do it. The Pizza Express in Woking, the I cannot sweat claim, the complete absence of empathy for the trafficking victims. The interview that, within hours of its broadcast, had ended his working royal career. The figure who walked into the interview believing that he could control its outcome had walked out of it having delivered the public testimony that, more than any single other piece of evidence, had made his eventual institutional removal inevitable. He had wanted to do it. This is the foundational fact about the November 2019 BBC Newsnight interview, and the foundation explains everything else about the catastrophe the interview produced. He had not been forced to participate. He had not been ambushed. The institutional advisors who managed his public communications had, by every account that has been preserved from the period, advised against the interview, with the kind of unanimous insistence that royal press advisors rarely produce. He had overruled them. He had concluded that he could, by the force of his own personality and the substance of his own account, restore his public reputation through an extended televised conversation with a serious British journalist. The conclusion was an error. The error was not in itself surprising. Andrew, across his life, had operated under the framework that his presence in any room would resolve to his advantage. The framework had served him through the management of staff, through the management of women who came within range of his life, through the management of the various institutional figures who had absorbed his conduct across the decades. The framework had not in fact served him in every encounter. The press coverage he had been receiving since the 1980s had documented the failures, but the framework had served him sufficiently often that he had not by 2019 been required to revise it. He decided to revise it now. The revision would be conducted on national television, in a 1-hour interview with one of the most disciplined journalists working in British broadcasting, on a topic that had been generating the most serious press scrutiny of his entire public career. The setting could not have been less suited to the framework he was operating under. The framework's insistence that his personal presence would resolve to his advantage had no application to a setting in which the journalist conducting the interview had prepared the questions in advance, had decided the structure of the encounter in advance, and had been working at her professional level for long enough to recognize that the figure across from her was producing the kind of testimony that would, when the interview aired, end his public career. The interview was recorded on the 14th of November 2019 at Buckingham Palace. The journalist was Emily Maitlis, a senior presenter for BBC Newsnight. Maitlis had been preparing for the interview across the preceding weeks. The palace had agreed to the interview on the condition that the questioning would address the full range of the Epstein allegations directly. Andrew had agreed to the conditions. He had been, by his own subsequent statements and by the accounts of those who saw him in the days before the interview, confident about the outcome. The interview ran for approximately 50 minutes. It was broadcast on the 16th of November 2019 in the standard Newsnight slot. The audience for the broadcast was, by the standards of British current affairs programming, very large. The network had promoted the interview heavily, and the public interest in seeing Andrew address the Epstein allegations directly had produced the kind of audience that Newsnight rarely reached. The audience saw what the audience saw. The audience did not, by the immediate response, see what Andrew had been hoping the audience would see. What the audience saw instead was a man producing a series of explanations for his conduct that did not, by any reasonable assessment, hold together as a coherent account. The Pizza Express alibi was the first specific element of the interview that produced public derision. Andrew had been asked about the encounter Virginia Giuffre had described from March 2001, the encounter at Maxwell's London townhouse. Andrew had produced in response the claim that he could not have been at the encounter because he had been at a Pizza Express restaurant in Woking, a town in Surrey approximately 30 miles southwest of London. He had been, by his account, taking his daughter Beatrice to a children's birthday party at the Pizza Express on the date Virginia had specified. The alibi was, on its face, peculiar. The peculiarity was not the location itself. Pizza Express was a well-known chain of mid-market Italian restaurants, and the Woking branch was the kind of family-friendly establishment where children's birthday parties did in fact regularly take place. The peculiarity was the specificity. Andrew was claiming, 18 years after the event, to remember with certainty that he had been at a specific Pizza Express in a specific town on a specific date. The memory was being produced by the conditions of the alibi with the kind of forensic precision that ordinary human memory rarely achieves about ordinary social events from nearly 2 decades earlier. The British public absorbed the Pizza Express claim with the kind of immediate skepticism that television audiences develop for testimony that does not, on its face, ring true. The claim was discussed extensively in the days that followed. The Pizza Express in Woking became briefly one of the most photographed mid-market chain restaurants in the country. The branch's manager produced statements about whether they had any record of the prince's visit. The records were not conclusive. The claim was not directly disproved. The claim was also not in any reasonable public assessment accepted. The "I cannot sweat" claim was the second element of the interview that produced sustained public derision. Andrew had been asked about Virginia's account of meeting him at the London nightclub Tramp in 2001, an account in which Virginia had described Andrew as having been heavily perspiring during the evening at the club. Andrew had produced in response the claim that he had been suffering from a medical condition in 2001 that prevented him from sweating. The condition, by his account, had developed during his Falklands service in 1982, a result of an adrenaline reaction to combat conditions, and had persisted for some years before resolving. The claim was, like the Pizza Express alibi, peculiar in its specificity. Andrew was claiming to have had, for a specific period that conveniently included the dates of Virginia's allegations, a specific medical condition that conveniently disposed of one of the specific physical details of her account. The medical literature on stress-induced anhidrosis, the inability to sweat, does not include the kind of episodic, decade-spanning version of the condition that Andrew was describing. The claim, when examined by medical journalists in the days that followed the broadcast, was found to be unsupported by the medical understanding of the condition he was claiming to have had. The claim also did not, on its own terms, address the substantive allegation. Even if Andrew had not been sweating at the Tramp nightclub on the specific evening Virginia had described, the absence of perspiration would not have established the absence of his presence at the encounter. The claim was, by its structure, an attempt to discredit one specific detail of Virginia's testimony rather than to address the substance of what she had alleged. The British public watching the interview absorbed the structure as the diagnostic feature it was. Andrew was not addressing the allegations. He was attempting to find small inconsistencies in Virginia's testimony that would allow him to claim, by the cumulative effect of the inconsistencies, that her account could not be trusted. The strategy was the wrong strategy for the interview. Maitlis, who had been preparing for the interview for weeks, did not allow Andrew to rest on the discrediting of small details. She returned repeatedly to the substantive questions. She asked Andrew about his decision to continue the friendship with Epstein after Epstein's 2008 conviction. She asked him about the December 2010 visit to Epstein's New York mansion, the 4-day visit that had been documented by the photograph in Central Park. She asked him about the trafficking victims of the Epstein network and what he had observed of their treatment during his visits to Epstein's properties. Andrew's responses to these substantive questions revealed the deepest dimension of the public relations catastrophe the interview was producing. He was not, by every available indication, capable of producing the kind of empathetic acknowledgement of the victims that the interview's setting required. Maitlis asked him about his feelings toward the trafficking victims. Andrew, in response, produced statements that focused on himself, on his own embarrassment, his own difficulty, his own regret about the institutional consequences of his association with Epstein. The victims in his responses appeared as background context for his own situation rather than as the principal moral concern of the discussion. This was the diagnostic feature of the interview that produced in the broader public response the most lasting damage to Andrew's reputation. The British public was watching a senior member of the royal family discuss his association with a convicted sex trafficker. The public was watching the senior royal address the question of how he felt about the young women who had been trafficked through the network. The public was watching a man who, when given the opportunity to express empathy for the victims, produced statements that centered his own discomfort instead. The watching was producing in real time the conclusion that Andrew did not by any meaningful measure regret what had happened to the victims, that he regretted instead the institutional consequences for himself. A specific exchange in the interview captured the dimension with particular clarity. Maitlis asked Andrew whether he regretted the friendship with Epstein. Andrew responded that he did not regret the friendship in itself, that the friendship had given him the opportunity to meet various people he had found useful. The phrasing was the kind of phrasing that any reasonable communications advisor would have spent the preparation period attempting to drill out of him. The phrasing told the audience that Andrew had assessed his friendship with a convicted sex trafficker by the metric of professional usefulness, that the friendship had been, by his accounting, an asset rather than a moral problem. The phrasing went out to the broadcast audience exactly as Andrew had produced it. The phrasing produced in the immediate response the kind of public revulsion that public figures rarely recover from. The interview also included Andrew's specific statement about the photograph from Maxwell's London townhouse. He had been asked whether the photograph was authentic. He had responded that he could not recall the encounter the photograph documented. He had suggested that the photograph might have been digitally manipulated. He had added, in a phrase that captured the broader posture of the interview, that he had no recollection of meeting Virginia Giuffre. The phrase was the kind of phrase that legal advisors typically use when their clients are denying allegations they cannot affirmatively disprove. The phrase was not the phrase that a public relations recovery effort required. The audience absorbed the phrase as the legal posture it was. The audience concluded that Andrew was, by the institutional standards of denial, denying the encounter while leaving open the possibility that the encounter had occurred. Maitlis, throughout the interview, conducted the questioning with the kind of professional discipline that had been her trademark across her career. She did not raise her voice. She did not produce theatrical reactions to Andrew's responses. She let him talk. She returned to the questions when his answers had not addressed them. She allowed the inadequacy of his answers to register on the audience without intervention from her. The technique was the technique that interviewing professionals use when the subject is producing testimony that is damaging itself, the technique of stepping back and allowing the damage to occur. The damage occurred. The interview ran on the 16th of November. The British press, across the days that followed, produced the kind of unanimous response that a self-inflicted public disaster of this scale tends to produce. The right-leaning press and the left-leaning press, the broadsheets and the tabloids, the broadcast journalists and the print journalists, all produced versions of the same assessment. The interview had been a catastrophe. The figure who had agreed to it had not, by his performance, restored his public reputation. The figure had instead ended his public reputation by his performance. Andrew, by every account from those who saw him in the days following the broadcast, did not initially understand the scale of the catastrophe. He had been pleased immediately after the recording with how the interview had gone. He had told Meitlis after the recording concluded that he hoped to do additional interviews with her in the future, that there were specific topics he had not been able to fully address that he would like to address in subsequent conversations. The post-interview pleasure he expressed has been preserved in Meitlis's subsequent recollections of the encounter. He had thought the interview had been a success. He had been the only person in the room who had thought so. His specific complaint about the interview, expressed to Meitlis after the recording, captured the depth of his miscalculation. Emily Meitlis has revealed Prince Andrew's strange request after their Newsnight interview ended. The former BBC journalist said the Duke of York had asked if they could spend more time talking about Pizza Express and his sweating, as he said they didn't include his alibi. Reader's Digest. The complaint reveals everything. Andrew had concluded that the interview's deficiency, from his perspective, was that it had not included sufficient discussion of the Pizza Express alibi and the sweating claim. He had wanted more time to make these claims. He had concluded that the claims given more airtime would have been more persuasive. He had not registered, in the immediate aftermath of the recording, that the claims themselves were the principal sources of the damage the interview was about to produce. The framework he had been operating under, the framework that held that his personal account would resolve any encounter in his favor, had not equipped him to assess the testimony he had just produced from any perspective other than his own. The institution responded faster than Andrew did. By the 20th of November, 4 days after the broadcast, the palace had concluded that the interview's consequences required institutional action. The Queen agreed to the action her advisers recommended. Andrew on that day issued a statement announcing that he was stepping back from public royal duties for the foreseeable future. The statement was the institutional acknowledgement that his working royal career was over. He would not from that point forward conduct the official engagements that senior royals performed. He would not represent the institution in public capacities. He would, while retaining his title and his royal status, be effectively retired from active royal service. The stepping back was at the time framed as a temporary measure. The framing was the institutional convention. Senior royals who had encountered public relations difficulties had, in previous decades, sometimes returned to active duties after a period of reduced visibility. The framing left open the possibility that Andrew might, after sufficient time, return to the working royal role he had been performing before the interview. He did not return. The foreseeable future of the November 2019 statement extended, across the years that followed, into permanent retirement from the working royal family. The 2021 Family Summit that we examined in an earlier part formalized internally the conclusion that no return would be possible. The October 2025 stripping of titles formalized, externally, the conclusion that the family had reached privately 4 years earlier. The Newsnight interview, in the longer institutional retrospective, was the moment at which the protection that had been operating around Andrew became publicly unsustainable. The protection had survived various press scandals across the decades. The protection had survived the 2011 trade envoy resignation. The protection had survived the initial 2015 emergence of the Giuffre allegations. The protection had not survived the November 2019 broadcast. The 50 minutes of footage had produced in the institutional accounting that the palace conducted evidence that the figure being protected had become structurally indefensible. The footage was on tape. The footage could be reviewed. The footage produced on every viewing the same conclusion. The figure on the tape was not a figure the institution could continue to publicly defend. There is one further dimension of the interview that this documentary needs to address before moving to the final part. The dimension concerns the trafficking victims and how the interview treated them. The interview, across its 50 minutes, did not include any meaningful expression of empathy for the trafficking victims. Andrew was given multiple opportunities to express the empathy. Meitlis asked him directly. Andrew did not produce the expression. He produced statements about himself, about his own embarrassment, about his own situation. The victims appeared in his framing as background figures whose suffering was relevant to the discussion only insofar as it had created institutional difficulties for him. The framing was, in retrospect, the dimension of the interview that had the most lasting effect on the moral assessment of Andrew that the British public produced across the subsequent years. The British public, across its various political and social divisions, had absorbed across the decades a broad consensus about how senior public figures were expected to address questions involving abuse victims. The consensus required, at minimum, expressions of empathy. The expressions did not have to be elaborate. They had to be sincere enough to register as authentic. Andrew, in the Newsnight interview, did not produce the expressions at any registrable level of sincerity. The absence registered. The British public, watching, concluded that Andrew did not actually feel the empathy. The conclusion has, across the years since, not been substantially modified by anything Andrew has produced subsequently. The conclusion was the final foundation of the institutional collapse that would eventually occur in October 2025. The palace could absorb a senior royal who had been associated with a sex trafficker. The palace could absorb a senior royal who had been the subject of civil litigation by a trafficking victim. The palace could absorb a senior royal who had been required to settle the litigation for a substantial sum. The palace could not indefinitely absorb a senior royal whom the British public had concluded did not, in any meaningful moral sense, regret what had happened to the victims. The conclusion was Virginia Giuffre's posthumous accomplishment, in the sense that her testimony had been the principal occasion for the British public's examination of the question. The accomplishment had been delivered ultimately by Andrew's own conduct in the interview that he had insisted on doing. The institution had been protecting him for 60 years. The protection had finally been undone, more than by any external pressure, by the figure being protected. He had walked into the interview believing that he could resolve the situation in his favor. He had walked out of it having delivered on national television the testimony that made his eventual institutional removal inevitable. In the final part, we move to the institutional removal itself. The October 2025 announcement, the stripping of the title of prince, the eviction from Royal Lodge, the letters patent, the first British prince in over 100 years to lose his title, the new name, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the move to the Sandringham property funded privately by the king, the closing meditation on the women who paid the price across the long arc of his life, the trafficking victims, the staff, the wife, the daughters, the mother who had loved him and who had, by her death in 2022, finally created the institutional conditions that allowed the protection to end. Because Virginia Giuffre had not in the end lived to see the institutional removal of the man whose conduct she had pursued for so much of her adult life. The removal had come 6 months after her death. The completion was, in the most direct sense, her work. The completion was also, in the broader sense, the work of every woman who had been part of the trafficking network and who had produced, individually and collectively, the testimony that the institution had finally been required to act on. The next part is about what they accomplished and what it cost them to accomplish it. The announcement came on the 30th of October, 2025. Buckingham Palace issued a brief statement at midday. The statement contained, in the disciplined institutional language that the palace reserves for actions of historic significance, the conclusion that 40 years of accumulated entitlement had finally produced. His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles and honours of Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew will now be known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The statement continued. His lease on Royal Lodge has to date provided him with legal protection to continue in residence. Formal notice has now been served to surrender the lease, and he will move to alternative private accommodation. These censures are deemed necessary, notwithstanding the fact that he continues to deny the allegations against him. The language is worth examining for what it includes and what it omits. The action being taken is the removal of his style, titles and honours. The reasoning, framed in the most institutionally minimal terms, is that the censures are deemed necessary. The deemer is not specified. The necessity is not justified by reference to specific findings. The institution is producing the action as the institution's decision, on the institution's authority, for reasons the institution does not feel obliged to explain to anyone outside itself. What the statement does specify is that Andrew continues to deny the allegations against him. The specification is significant. The palace, in announcing the strongest action it had taken against a member of the immediate royal family in over 100 years, was simultaneously preserving Andrew's denial of the underlying conduct. The denial was being preserved because the institution had concluded that maintaining the denial was, on the institutional accounting, less costly than acknowledging that the institution had concluded the allegations were credible. The denial was a fiction the institution would continue to maintain. The action being taken was the action that the fiction's institutional unsustainability had, finally, required. The announcement was the culmination of pressure that had been building across the preceding 3 weeks. On the 17th of October, Andrew had himself issued a statement announcing that he would no longer use his titles or the honors that had been conferred upon him. The October 17th statement had been framed as a voluntary action by Andrew, the kind of institutional gesture that allowed him to retain a degree of dignity by appearing to make the decision himself. The framing had not, in the institutional reception, accomplished what Andrew had been hoping for. The British press and the British public had absorbed the October 17th statement as inadequate. The pressure for further action had continued to build across the following 2 weeks. 2 specific developments accelerated the pressure during those 2 weeks. The first was the publication, on the 21st of October, of Virginia Giuffre's posthumous memoir. The memoir produced extensive press coverage across the British and international media. The coverage included detailed accounts of the encounters Virginia had described between herself and Andrew. The coverage produced in the public response the kind of moral revulsion that the institution had been attempting to absorb without responding to since 2014. The second development was the emergence of new questions about the financial arrangements that had allowed Andrew to maintain his lifestyle without active royal duties. Specifically, the press reported in detail on the lease arrangement under which Andrew occupied Royal Lodge. The reporting documented that Andrew had paid £1 million for a 75-year lease on the property in 2003. He had been required by the terms of the lease to spend approximately £7.5 million on refurbishments, which he completed by 2005. From 2005 forward, by the lease terms, he had been required to pay only 1 peppercorn of rent if demanded per year. The standard British legal phrasing for a nominal annual rent of 1 penny or some equivalent symbolic amount. The lease arrangement, when it became public knowledge in October 2025, produced the kind of widespread public anger that financial revelations of this kind tend to produce. Royal Lodge was a 30-room mansion on prime land within Windsor Great Park. The British taxpayer had effectively subsidized Andrew's occupation of it for 2 decades. He had not paid market rent, he had not been required to. He had benefited from the institutional position that had allowed him to negotiate the peppercorn arrangement, and he had benefited from the protection of the institution that had prevented the arrangement from being publicly examined for as long as the protection held. The combined pressure of the memoir publication and the Royal Lodge revelations produced, by the last days of October, the institutional situation that the palace had been working to avoid. The protection of Andrew had become more institutionally costly than the institution could continue to bear. The pressure to act had become greater than the pressure to maintain the status quo. The decision was made. The announcement followed on the 30th of October. The letters patent, the formal legal instrument that effected the removal of Andrew's style and title, were issued on the 3rd of November 2025. The letters patent, by the constitutional mechanism through which the British monarchy operates such actions, were issued under the Great Seal of the realm. The text declared that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor shall no longer be entitled to hold and enjoy the style, title, or attribute of Royal Highness, and the titular dignity of Prince. The legal action was, in the historical context of British royal precedent, almost without comparison. The last time a British prince had had his title removed by the Crown was 1919, when Prince Ernest Augustus, who held both British and Hanoverian royal status, had his British titles stripped under the Titles Deprivation Act 1917 for fighting on the German side during the First World War. The 1919 case had involved a foreign resident royal who had taken arms against Britain in a major war. The 2025 case involved Andrew. The institutional decision that the 2025 case justified comparable action was, by the precedent it set, a significant institutional departure. The action did not, however, remove Andrew from the line of succession. He remained, after the stripping, 8th in the line of succession to the British throne. The succession, by the constitutional structure of the British monarchy, could be modified only by Act of Parliament with the consent of the Commonwealth nations whose constitutions the British succession affected. The legislative complexity of removing Andrew from the succession was sufficient that the institution had decided not to pursue it. He would remain theoretically eligible to succeed if a sufficiently improbable sequence of deaths in the family ahead of him produced the conditions for his succession. The eligibility was theoretical, the probability was negligible. The legal complexity was sufficient that the institution preferred to leave the eligibility intact rather than pursue the legislative action that would have removed it. The eviction from Royal Lodge proceeded across the weeks following the announcement. Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, who had also, on the 17th of October, when Andrew had relinquished his titles, ceased to use the title Duchess of York, both vacated the property. The vacation was managed with the kind of institutional discretion that the palace had deployed in similar transitions. The press was not invited to observe the moves. The principals did not produce public statements about the vacation. The household at Royal Lodge, which had been operational for over 20 years, was disassembled and the property prepared for whatever institutional purpose the Crown would assign to it next. Andrew moved to a property on the Sandringham estate, the Norfolk royal estate that the King personally owned rather than the Crown holding it institutionally. The new residence had been arranged through King Charles's personal financial resources. The arrangement was significant in two specific dimensions. The first was that the King was personally funding his brother's accommodation, in a final extension of the institutional protection that the King had been required to formally end. The protection was now personal rather than institutional. The brother who had been carrying his younger brother's costs throughout his life would continue, in attenuated form, to carry them. The second dimension was that the move to Sandringham removed Andrew from the immediate vicinity of Windsor, the location where most of the senior working royals were based, and placed him in a more remote part of the country where his presence would be less visible to the institutional life of the family. Sarah Ferguson made her own arrangements. She had not, by the terms of the divorce in 1996, retained personal claim to royal accommodations beyond what her continued occupation of Royal Lodge with Andrew had provided. The eviction from Royal Lodge ended her residential security in any property associated with the royal family. She relocated to private accommodations at her own expense. The relocation, across the weeks that followed the eviction announcement, was managed without public disclosure of her specific destination. The two daughters retained their princess titles, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, by the institutional rules that governed the royal style, held their titles by the letters patent of King George V from 1917, a constitutional instrument that defined royal status for the children of British monarchs. The instrument continued to apply to them regardless of their father's institutional status. Beatrice would remain Princess Beatrice. Eugenie would remain Princess Eugenie. The institutional decision had been deliberate. The daughters, by every account from those familiar with the discussions, had not been responsible for any of the conduct that had produced their father's institutional removal. Their titles were preserved as the institutional acknowledgement of this. The closing of this part requires the closing of the documentary itself. Across the 7 preceding parts and this final one, this documentary has been examining the long arc of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's life, from his birth in February 1960 as the favoured second son of the reigning monarch, through his Falklands service, his marriage and divorce, his bullying of staff, his trade envoy years, his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, his catastrophic 2019 interview, his 2022 settlement with Virginia Giuffre, and finally his 2025 institutional removal. The arc has been one of accumulated entitlement, accumulated cost to the people around him, and accumulated institutional inability to continue absorbing the cost. The women around him paid the price. This is the specific framing the documentary's title introduced, and the framing has been the structural foundation of the analysis throughout. The price was paid in different forms by different women across the long span of his life. The first to pay was Koo Stark, who was set aside in 1983 because the institutional pressure had decided she was not acceptable. She paid by the loss of the relationship. She also paid, across the years that followed, by maintaining her dignity in conditions that had not entitled her to any of it. The second was Sarah Ferguson, who was destroyed by the British press across the early years of her marriage and who, when the marriage failed in the form documented by the August 1992 photographs, was institutionally diminished from HRH the Duchess of York to merely the Duchess of York. She paid for the marriage in the loss of her institutional standing and in the public humiliation that her photographs had produced. She paid further by the unusual cohabitation arrangement that had operated for 30 years and that had, by structurally preventing her from fully separating from Andrew, prevented her from constructing the independent post-divorce life that other women in similar positions had been able to construct. The third group were the staff. Across 40 years of his royal career, the staff who worked in his immediate vicinity absorbed the bullying, the entitled demands, the small daily abuses that the documented record now preserves. The aide reduced to tears in the pre-dawn phone call. David Anderson called a fecking imbecile at Hillsborough Castle. The man dismissed for the mole on his face. The man dismissed for the nylon tie. Charlotte Biggs, the maid trained for a full day on the correct arrangement of his teddy bears. The diplomat whose place setting had been removed during a brief absence from the dining room. The dozens of other staff members whose specific cases have not been individually documented, but whose cumulative experience constituted the working environment that the institution had been quietly absorbing for 40 years. The fourth group, the most morally weighted in the long retrospective examination, were the trafficking victims of the Epstein network. The number of women involved in the network has never been precisely established. The federal investigations and the various civil proceedings have identified, by various estimates, somewhere between dozens and hundreds of victims. The women were, in most cases, young women from disadvantaged backgrounds, runaways, girls from broken families, girls who had been recruited through the network's standard recruitment methods. They had been brought into Epstein's circle and used. The using had included sexual contact with men in Epstein's social network, including by Virginia Giuffre's testimony, with Andrew on 3 occasions across 2001. The most prominent of the trafficking victims, the one whose name the British public has come to know, was Virginia Roberts Giuffre. She had been 17 years old at the time of the first encounter Virginia described with Andrew. She spent the next 2 decades of her life pursuing the institutional accountability that her testimony had been designed to produce. She filed the civil suit in 2021. She settled it in 2022. She continued the public testimony across the years that followed. She produced in the months before her death the memoir that would be published in October 2025. She took her own life on the 24th of April 2025, at the age of 41. She did not live to see the institutional removal of the man whose conduct she had pursued for so much of her adult life. The removal came 6 months after her death. The completion was, in the most direct sense, her work. The fifth woman who paid was in some way that the institutional accounting will continue to process across the decades to come, the mother. The Queen had loved Andrew. The Queen had been throughout his life his most consistent institutional protector. She had used her authority across the decades to maintain his position, to absorb the costs of his conduct, to delay the institutional consequences that her death would, in 2022, finally make institutionally possible. She had not been responsible in any direct sense for what he had done. She had, however, been the foundation on which the framework of his entitlement had been built. The favored child had been favored by her. The framework that had produced his subsequent conduct had been formed by her early treatment of him, and had been protected, across the years, by her continuing institutional support. She had, by her love for him, made possible the conditions that had cost the other women across his life what it had cost them. The cost to her by her own private accounting has not been recorded. She did not in her later years produce public statements about her son's conduct. She maintained the institutional silence that her position required of her. The internal accounting she conducted about what her favorite child had become was, by the conventions of her generation and her position, not something she made available to anyone else. The accounting probably existed. It probably included, in the ways that maternal accountings tend to include such things, some recognition of the gap between the boy she had loved and the man he had become. The recognition probably did not, by every available indication, modify the love. The love continued. The protection continued for as long as she was alive to provide it. When she died in September 2022, the protection ended. The institutional conditions for the actions that would, 3 years later, produce Andrew's removal were established by her death. The son who had been protected by his mother was, after her death, the brother of the king. The brother had a different institutional calculation. The brother had absorbed, across his own life, the consequences of the differential treatment that had favored Andrew over himself. The brother had by every account no particular interest in continuing the institutional protection his mother had maintained. When the institutional pressure required the action, the brother authorized it. The mother's death had made the action possible. The action came in the year and a half after her death, in the form the institutional pressure required. This documentary has been about Andrew. It has been more centrally, however, about the women whose lives he affected. The structural fact of the framework Andrew operated under, the framework of entitlement formed in his earliest years, was that the framework produced costs that were paid by other people. The other people, across the long span of his life, were predominantly women. Some of them have been named, many of them, particularly among the trafficking victims of the Epstein network, will never be named publicly. All of them paid something. Some of them paid catastrophically. The institution that protected Andrew across the decades is the institution that this documentary has, by examining his life, also been examining. The institution had its own framework. The framework held that the protection of senior royals was the standard institutional response to difficulties involving them. The framework had operated for the Queen Mother. The framework had operated for Prince Philip. The framework had operated for Anne. The framework had operated for Andrew until October 2025, when the cumulative cost finally exceeded what the framework could absorb. The institutional ending in October 2025 was not justice. Justice, in the legal sense that the trafficking victims had been pursuing across the decades, would have required criminal prosecutions that the institutional structure of British public life had been designed to prevent. The ending was, instead, the institution's acknowledgement that the cost-benefit calculation it had been conducting on Andrew's behalf had finally tipped. The protection had become more costly than the figure being protected was worth. The protection ended. The figure was, from that point forward, on his own. He is 65 years old. As of the year of this documentary's production, he lives at the Sandringham property funded privately by his brother. He is no longer a prince. He is no longer His Royal Highness. He is no longer the Duke of York. He is Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, a private citizen with a name and a complicated public history. He continues to deny the allegations against him. The denial by the institutional structure that has now removed him will not be tested in any further legal proceedings. The denial will stand, formally, as long as he lives. The women whose lives he affected will not in any meaningful sense be compensated by the action the institution finally took. Virginia Giuffre is dead. Sarah Ferguson has lost her institutional standing and her residence. The staff who absorbed the bullying have absorbed it permanently. The trafficking victims of the Epstein network, whose names the public will never know, have absorbed what they absorbed. The institutional action of October 2025 cannot, by its nature, undo any of what was done to them. What the action accomplished was, instead, the institutional acknowledgement that what was done to them mattered. The acknowledgement was incomplete. The acknowledgement was decades late. The acknowledgement was, by the standards of full justice, inadequate. The acknowledgement, however, was not nothing. The institutional pattern that had been protecting senior royals from the consequences of their conduct toward the people around them had, in this single case, and after extraordinary pressure from a woman who did not live to see the result, finally been altered. The pattern had not been ended in any general sense. The institution remains, by its structure, available to absorb similar conduct in similar future cases, but the pattern had been, in this single case, broken. Virginia Giuffre's name will not, in the institutional histories of the British monarchy that will be written in the decades to come, occupy the central position. The histories will record Andrew's life. The histories will document his birth and his Falklands service, and his marriage and his Epstein years, and his removal. The histories will treat Virginia in conventional institutional fashion as a secondary figure whose role in the story was to provide the testimony that produced the consequences for the principal subject. The conventional treatment will not capture what she actually accomplished. What she actually accomplished was the alteration of the institutional pattern. She did this across 2 decades of testimony against the institutional pressure that had been applied to her at every stage. She did this while building a family, raising children, managing the chronic effects of the abuse she had survived. She did this while knowing that the institutional pattern had been designed specifically to defeat exactly the kind of testimony she was producing. She accomplished it. The institution, by its own October 2025 action, conceded the accomplishment. The figure she had pursued was no longer a prince. The protection had ended. The pattern in this case had been broken. She did not live to see it. She had taken her own life 6 months before the institution finally acted. She had spent the last decade of her life working toward a result she did not in the end get to witness. The result came after her. The result was, by every reasonable assessment of the institutional history that has produced this documentary, hers. The palace continues to operate. The royal family continues to function. The institution continues to absorb the costs of senior royal conduct in the ways the institution has always absorbed them. The October 2025 action against Andrew will be processed, across the years and decades to come, into the historical record that the institution maintains about itself. The action will be one item in a long list of institutional adjustments the family has made across its history. The women, however, are the central figures of this documentary. They are also, in the broader moral accounting that this documentary has been conducting, the central figures of the story. They paid the price across the long arc of his life. They paid the price during the decades when the institution was protecting him. They continue to pay the price in the various ways that abuse and institutional failure leave permanent damage after the institution has finally stopped protecting him. Andrew was entitled. The women around him paid the price. The institution that had been protecting him, across 40 years of accumulated evidence that the protection was producing cost the women could not afford to pay, finally stopped protecting him. The stopping was, by the standards of full justice, far too late. The stopping was, by the standards of the institutional pattern that had been operating for decades, almost without precedent. Both of these statements are true. The truth that the women, and one woman in particular who did not live to see her work completed, had finally produced an institutional consequence, is the truth this documentary has been built around. The institution had stopped, in this case, protecting him. The stopping was their work. Thanks for watching the full documentary. If you like this type of documentary, then please stay with us by subscribing to our channel.